On the heavenly battle arena, two armed players stood motionless opposite each other, exchanging phrases before starting. The system introduced the first guy player as Dean with a swordsman class from the second rank. The second player was a girl who was announced as Nagi. She was a swordsman with an available first rank. For a few more seconds, the opponents exchanged glances. After a moment, player Dean rushed to attack the motionless girl. Dean quickly drew his giant sword for a crushing blow to Nagi, who had already prepared for a counterattack and held out her defenses. The girl powerfully pushed her opponent, who flew far back and launched a giant flaming ball of fire at him, increasing in front of his eyes. Dean put up a defensive shield, but the impact was so strong that he was thrown back a few meters. As he flew backwards, he had time to watch as Nagi summoned her next powerful, flaming sword move in the light of the paralyzing lightning. The fiery strike flew off the girl's sword in the exact second and headed straight for Dean, crashing into him like a sharp blade. Zanhev, the guy on the bus, finished reading a page on his phone and cursed unhappily, clearly unhappy with this turn of events. He thought he'd read a chapter for nothing just because he'd heard somewhere what an interesting storyline it would be. Still, it didn't live up to his expectations at all. The guy went to the comic discussion forum and posted his opinion, expressing his confusion about the victory of the strongest player over the leading player and what he would have done himself. At the same time, somewhere completely different, someone somewhere else only laughed at this bold commenter. The unknown person thought that since the guy had already left such a funny comment, he should not be disappointed afterward. While tapping something on the tablet screen, he said that if he were so confident, he would try something right now. Zanhev, still on the bus, saw the first likes on his comment and thought with a chuckle that it was a good start. The unknown person wrote back that the story was more revealing of the main character's development, and the guy wondered in bewilderment why he was being so ridiculous in explaining the point of the comic. The guy cheerfully thought it was ridiculous to write off the plot reveal. Anyway, this forum was designed to be relaxing. While this kid on the bus was fully immersed in the discussions on the forum, a girl approached him and asked him to move his bag from the seat next to him. Zanhev stared at the girl with huge eyes in complete shock and stared at her silently out of confusion. He couldn't help but recognize the cute girl named Yoon Hae-so, but he continued to stare at her for a while in surprise. After a few seconds, Zan picked up his backpack and the girl sat beside him, watching something on her phone. The guy felt somewhat awkward and didn't know whether to pretend he didn't know her, even though he didn't, or vice versa. He silently continued to stare at Yoon Hae-so, his classmate. Although they weren't the least bit close, she still sat next to him. The girl was quite popular in their class, but with Zan He next to her, they could not interact with each other. All the guys took turns getting off the bus, and Yoon Hae-so suddenly held out her pack of cigarettes to the guy, asking him to take it. Zanhev stared at the cigarettes with wild surprise, because he didn't smoke, and he didn't need them at all. The guy and the girl were standing by the schoolyard, and he was trying to find the right words to explain that he didn't need them. Yoon Hae-so smiled and said she had just been summoned by the class teacher, and was asking him to hold them temporarily and return them at lunch break. Zanhev was confused by what he heard, but still decided to ask the popular classmate why she had asked him. After a bit of silence, the girl cheerfully stated that it was because they were friends. Sometime later, a loud clatter of noisy kids could be heard at a school break in one of the classes. While everyone was having fun and goofing around, Zanhev pondered why he had taken this packet and what he should do with it now. He was also thinking that she was a little too fussy and could have kept them for herself, and why a high school girl would want cigarettes in the first place. He heard his classmates talking about the popular comic book he had read on the bus earlier. Yoon Hae-so heard something about a flaming sword and attacks, and laughing loudly wondered what it was about. Zanhev looked at the girl surrounded by other guys hanging out on their phones and labeled them as the main characters of his class. He silently clutched the pack of cigarettes in his hand and, looking askew at the popular guys and thinking about the bad timing, decided to give it to her at lunch. Zanhev was still interested in his classmates' arguments about the comic book's latest flaming sword crushing move. One of the popular guys spoke highly of the last chapter, while another asked for a normal explanation of its content. Suddenly, a guy in the company of the class's main characters heard someone clarify with them if the player was the one they were talking about now. For some reason, Zanhev decided to intervene in their elite conversation and informed everyone that he too had recently read it. He went on to talk about the very flaming sword that appeared in the last chapter of the comic and heard only weak agreements in response. The guy continued talking, giving his point of view on the plot, and the guys listening to him looked at each other in confusion. Zainhev was like a bucket of ice water because after such an ambiguous reaction, he was unsure that they were discussing the comic book. He instantly realized that it wasn't about what they were talking about, but that he had interjected himself into their conversation, even though he wasn't close to them. Zainhev immediately blushed and crumpled in place from nerves, apologizing for interrupting their conversation so unexpectedly. Yoon Hae-so immediately recognized the guy and thought the worst of him, sincerely considering him a loser. Taking a serious look, one of the company guys asked the first friend if he was socializing with Zainhev and heard a negative answer. The guy turned to one of the girls with the same question and saw a negative nod. The last victim of the interrogation was Yoon Hae-so, who was asked in the most menacing tone by the guy if she was communicating with him. Zainhev's mind immediately flashed back to a fresh memory when she had said they were friends in the schoolyard. But what the guy heard wasn't what was in his head at all, but that Yoon Hae-so, it turns out, doesn't even know him. Zainhev was silently moving away from the company, listening to their heated discussion about today's lunch of delicious rice prosecco, which they called appetizers and salads with rice. Suddenly, a heavy hand fell on the guy's shoulder, and behind his back, someone questioningly asked if he read comics and forums. The unknown guy tells Zainhev that he reads it all weekly so he doesn't miss anything. The stranger named Kim Taiwan didn't have time to introduce himself to the guy as he hurriedly left the classroom. Zainhev visibly awkwardly walked past the popular company of the class protagonists, not even raising his head in embarrassment. Kim Tae-won only calmly looked at the ridiculous situation from the sidelines without saying another word. Zainhev stood aloofly in the corner of the school stadium during gym class, watching the others play and have fun. He involuntarily cursed in his head and considered it the strangest situation that had happened to him in recent times. The guy was angry at Yoon Hae-so, who was only doing everything for her own benefit, and decided to do one thing for himself. No matter what their relationship was, it was no longer his business. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by the very popular head of their class, shouting loudly for a ball to fly towards him now. Zainhev froze with anticipation and just stared at the ball flying right at him, hearing his classmate ask him to cover the goal. The guy was already in a bad mood, and now there was also this ball, which definitely added to the depressing atmosphere. He had already kicked it a few times in his head, but in reality, he only rushed towards the ball with a menacing look. A second later, the ball had already flown past him. Zainhev quickly realized how he had again gotten into an awkward situation with the same guys. A classmate standing on the goal watching the running Zan was sure he would kick it away, but the ball had already been caught by their net. The boys on the other team shouted triumphantly about their victory and cheerfully announced that their opponents would be charged ice cream for their defeat. Zainhev awkwardly and embarrassingly turned around at the goal with the ball caught in it and said something inarticulate and inappropriate for the situation. At the same moment, he heard a classmate insult him for such an act and began nervously apologizing for everything. An angry classmate named Lin Shu was coming straight at him. Zan was already visibly frightened before he passed by with a direct address to goalkeeper Kim. Lin switched to running and shouted in parallel, asking how it was possible to not block such a simple shot. Kim, the goalie, only cheerfully said that he was distracted by the Webtoon, which the guys called the forum comic among themselves, and was reprimanded by the guys for it. The guys pounced on the classmate, asking him to take his mind off all this nonsense for at least half of the game. They continued to yell at their buddy as Zan stared in amazement at the unfolding scene. The very same pack of cigarettes that Zan had been keeping from En was already in the school bathroom toilet. Zan sat in the toilet, busy reading the Webtoon, not realizing what could have distracted Kim from the game. After a little more forum reading, he realized that he wasn't any better because he was sitting here hiding instead of going to gym class. The guy again remembered his mistake, which he obviously could not forgive himself for. With a loud bang, he pounded his fists on the toilet door, burning with shame at his failure. Zainhev regretted it because he had a great opportunity to prove himself, but he couldn't. While he was regretfully wallowing, familiar voices were heard in the restroom, talking about ice cream and his failure. Zan quickly realized that his classmates had come inside and were discussing the soccer game that had ended in an unfortunate way for them. He didn't understand why PE was over so quickly, but he wasn't about to leave his hiding place right now. Outside the door, Lin was telling someone that it was just about time to discuss a recent incident. When another classmate asked Lin what the discussion would be about, Lin replied that it was about Zainhev's intervention. They started discussing how the guy had jumped into their conversation this morning and that he always does that, which is very annoying. One of the guys asked Kim Taewon why he always covers for Zaina, for example, even today. Lin put his arm around Kim and informed him that the whole reason was that they had gone to middle school together with Zan. Zan continued to eavesdrop on the conversation with bated breath as someone asked if they were close, to which he heard Kim reply that they weren't at all. Tavan responded by putting his hand on Lin's shoulder, much to his surprise, and continued talking. Kim explained to all the classmates standing with him that he felt sorry for them and nothing more. At that moment, the bell for the next class rang, and the guy started cheerfully saying that if they were late for Korean, the teacher would beat them with a pointer, and quickly got ready to leave. As the guys walked out into the hallway, they heard strange noises coming from one stall and turned around for a moment. Lin told his buddies that there was clearly someone huddled in the restroom, and it was probably Zan who called it weird. Zan Hev, huddled in the restroom door, finally exhaled quietly. The guy thought it was great that no one from the company had noticed him, and he could already go out rather than to class. As it turned out, not everyone came out of the restroom, and Kim stood there, loudly insulting the hidden Zan. Taewon stood exactly behind the door where the startled boy had been, clearly having heard his classmate's message. Those words caught him off guard, and he indulged in some reminiscing. Kim Taewon had been a very good and close friend of Yoon Hae-so for several years. The guy groggily plopped down on the floor, thinking sadly that there were enough defeats in real life as it was, and you didn't even need to read comic books for that. Clenching his hands into fists, Zan decided he'd had enough of all the bullying. He didn't want to feel left out anymore and wanted to be noticed by someone too. Somewhere in a parallel universe, a guy heard Zanhev's wishes and decided to do something for him in that case. He pressed something quickly on his control panel and shouted in the light of the electric lightning discharges that the guy should try this. Zanhev immediately noticed the change in his condition, specifically his shaking and trembling hands. He couldn't see anything for a moment and only heard a loud noise where someone seemed to be announcing some rules. The rules kept saying that an unknown person would appear. At the exact second, a surprised Zanhev moved into the heavenly arena in the middle of the battle. The guy didn't understand what had happened to him, and more importantly, how and why he was in a place that was very familiar to him. The girl fighter named Nagi, remaining completely calm, indifferently asked who this person was who had appeared in front of her. A few minutes earlier, when Nagi had struck Dean with her flaming sword, he had fallen to the ground with a clatter. When it was announced that, according to the game's rules, the fighter Dean could no longer continue the fight, and the results showed Nagi's player winning, the stands squealed. Two spectator players discussed the fight, saying it was just another boring one, and they only wasted a lot of money on it. The girl, however, replied to him that not really, because Dean managed to break through Nagi's wall of deep flames, even though he lost in the end. The spirited girl noticed the displeased face of her interlocutor and pounced on him with an explanation. She began to tell him that this was the first time in the history of battles that someone had been able to break through the defense of the blue flame wall. After the silence, the girl added that he had seen the historic moment with his eyes. He asked how this was possible, and heard in reply that Naga was of the first rank, so it was the first time. The girl cheerfully added with genuine excitement that it was an unwavering defense that no one had ever been able to overcome. One of the strongest defenses was the wall of blue flame that rose majestically beside Nagi and shimmered from pearlescent to bright blue. Everyone present in the heavenly arena knew that this was her hallmark. Suddenly, some kind of noise rose up in the heavenly arena, and everything near the Naga player seemed to shake. The golden-haired girl in the spectator stands was shocked by what she saw and jumped up from her seat to get a better look at what was going on there. From such an unexpected turn of events, her lollipop, which she had been chewing throughout the game, even fell out of her mouth. The girl was distraught. She had left the most delicious part of the lollipop for later, but never had time to eat it. Her companion looked at the sky arena in amazement and asked why she was telling him about the first time someone broke through the defense. The girl stood up from the floor in bewilderment, leaving the lollipop there, and asked again what she was talking about, noticing her buddy's gesture towards the arena. Oni shifted her gaze to the indicated side and noticed next to Nagi, her wall. Except there wasn't a wall there but a punctured fence, with an unknown guy standing in place before Nagi. The commentator informed everyone present that something amazing was happening as an unknown guy appeared in front of the invincible Nagi. He added that it all happened in the center of her protection spell. The wounded Dean watched the unfolding action lying on the battlefield's ground and thought that this simply couldn't be happening. How could the wall of blue flame that he, the great warrior, had worked so hard to destroy have stood? Dean, who was not just a fighter but a second-ranked fighter, could only barely snag that wall. And suddenly, some striving guy appeared and destroyed the great defense instantly, without even making any special effort. Everyone turned their attention to the guy who had appeared out of nowhere, asking many questions. On the other hand, Zanhev wasn't just surprised. He was shocked at what was happening, and it was clear from the look on his face. He looked around at the stands in the arena in fear, unable to understand how this could have happened to him, or if it was true. The boy began desperately trying to remember recent events, but other than sitting himself down in the restroom, he couldn't recall much. Zan gingerly looked behind him and began frantically reimagining the familiar image of the armed girl player. After a moment, he realized who was standing before him and where he had seen her. Nagi, remaining completely calm, again asked the boy to identify himself. Zanhev still remembered sitting on the bus on his phone, passionately reading the latest released chapter of a new comic book. According to his calculations, if he wasn't mistaken, just one of the characters from the popular webtoon The Player stood before him. Of course, the guy didn't believe in the reality of what was happening and decided to play along since he was here for the time being. Zan, proudly folding his arms across his chest, answered the girl's question about why she was so interested in this body's identity. He slowly approached her and told her that he thought it was all some sort of conscious dream, and he was so nervous and worried about nothing. Nagi warned him not to move, and the system showed her skills as a swordsman known for using the earth element. Zanhev confidently asked her what would happen if he moved, surprising Dean, who was still lying on the ground, by doing so. The commentator didn't miss the opportunity to clarify and said menacingly that Naga's power increased due to its connection to the earth. At this moment, Dean wondered if he was missing a good chance to get closer to his rival. Nagi saw the unknown man walking straight at her without any alarm or apprehension, and warned him not to take another step. Suddenly, the commentator announced that the stubbornness between the players would soon end. After his words, magical blue feathers flew into the air. The girl called for a new protective wall of blue flame to appear, which appeared at once. The audience was very surprised by the girl's unexpected power and watched with open mouths as to what would happen next. Dean, who had recently wanted to get closer, was already thinking only about how much strength she had and whether she ever got tired. The spectators shouted from the stands that such power even scares them a little, and here she was, the actual wall in all its glory. They scrutinized the guy and concluded that he was definitely finished, because even his appearance didn't cause any fear. Zanhen listened with bated breath to everything the spectators shouted and already began to wonder about the kind of wall they were talking about. Lying in the arena, Dean noticed the strange expression on the guy's face and hesitantly asked if he was okay. Zan felt a sudden whiff of a refreshing breeze and wondered if there was a reason for it. Nagi only stood her ground confidently and decided the guy wouldn't back down. Still, she wasn't a timid person herself. The girl took it as a challenge and reached for her sword, for he appeared through her protective wall and thus announced the battle. Nagi took a fighting stance and pointed her majestic sword directly at the guy who had been brave up to that moment. Dean was scared for a moment himself, because if Nagi drew her sword, she would be feared. But the other question was how such a thing was possible against this insignificant kid. The onlookers began to shout that they would rather see his strength already, while Zan himself shrank back in fright at the sight of what he thought was a huge knife. The guy quickly admitted his mistake, telling his rival about it. Still, she didn't even want to hear about it, as everyone already expected a show from her. Zan squirmed and hid inside himself, thinking that no matter what kind of dream it was in any case, the knife was an apparent overkill. On the other hand, the only thing that resounded through his mind and body was that he shouldn't be afraid and refuse to fight, because he was already here. The morning picture of the mist ball immediately appeared before his eyes, and he decided he couldn't be a failure even in his dreams. Otherwise, how could he live? Zan dared to look into Naga's eyes and decided firmly that he would not be afraid anymore. The thought that it was just some ridiculous dream kept running through his mind, and he went on the attack, shouting that he was not so simple. As if convincing himself, Zan shouted again, only much louder, that he was not as simple as she thought and would win. The guy with the crazy eyes ran straight for the sharp sword Nagi had displayed with his fists. Dean lay back and thought the guy had some stupid battle tactic. At the same time, Zan pondered the possibility of the reality of all that was happening. The guy's actions seemed very rash and stupid to everyone, but they were just spectators waiting for a bloody massacre. As Zanhev quickly ran towards the girl, he kept his eyes on her long and most likely sharp sword. He also noticed that the majestic sword in her hands was motionless, much like the girl herself. For a moment it seemed to him that she had no intention of destroying him, and he thought that she might have changed her mind. He continued running towards the sword, and decided that the girl would just parrot it for a bit and let it live. That very second, just as Zan reached his destination, he ran into that sword and was struck by it in multiple places. It was as if his body began to fall apart into several pieces and disappear into flickering black and blue light. Dust rose around the players in the heavenly battle arena, and the spectators shouted and demanded an explanation for what had just happened. Standing in a shroud of thick smoke, player Nagi called out a commentator to explain to the spectators what had happened in the arena. After a second, the girl looked menacingly at the announcer and asked him to announce the battle's results. He quickly realized that it was better not to joke with her. For all the worried spectators in the stands, the commentator loudly announced the guy's apparent inability to continue the fight. Only his arm peeked out of the pile of rocks formed by Zane's powerful impact on the ground, and the announcer declared Nagi's victory in this fight. The unknown man who had sent the guy to the battlefield was watching everything happening on the screen of his tablet and was not happy with this ending. He found it too dull and emotionless, fundamentally different from what the kid had promised, whimpering alone in the restroom. The unknown man smiled evasively and decided that such an ending was not satisfactory to him and simply would not be tolerated. He planned something insidious. He quickly clicked something on his gadget and selected the player Zanhev on one of the panels. At this time, Zanhev felt as if he was floating in weightlessness and began to slowly come to his senses and figure out where he was and what was wrong with him. Seeing nothing but emptiness around him, he quickly decided that he had simply died. He flew onward and sadly thought that it was the end this time, and perhaps it wasn't even a dream at all. Zanhev was still mumbling something while he was conscious, and the girl sitting next to him started to ask what was wrong with him. Seeing the guy's half-open eyes and slow return to life, she began to tell him to come to his senses and get up. When Zanhev finally came to his senses, he opened his mouth in surprise and saw a strange girl sitting before him, greeting him after his sleep. The mysterious stranger sat beside him and scrutinized the guy, noticing his surprised face and thinking how silly and ridiculous he looked. The long-haired girl was trying to get Zanhev to talk to her in some way, and every now and then she addressed him in various ways, but it was as if he didn't understand her. While the girl was wondering why the guy didn't answer her, he had time to look around and ask uncertainly what kind of place he was in. Suddenly, at that very second, his voice was bound by a powerful force like an embrace of flame, depriving him of the ability to free himself. The boy immediately coughed and began to feel himself suffocating. At the same time, the stranger held him in a vice and said that she was being kind and looking after him, who had come here without asking. The girl squeezed the lad's throat even harder with her fiery strength, and went on to say that after all this, how dare he ask her about it and question her at all. She raised him high above her head in rage and squeezed the fiery noose around Zane's neck harder and harder, with each passing second. The boy seemed unable to move or breathe when the angry stranger told him it was time for him to disappear. Just as the girl was about to finish him off, she heard a familiar voice behind her, ordering her to stop. At the same time, the noose around the guy's neck slowly disappeared, and he started coughing loudly, greedily gulping for air. Zanhev fell to the floor with a clatter and coughed loudly for a while longer, holding his neck as someone else approached him. That same unknown guy began apologizing for the girl he said had just recently been born. The guy approached the astonished Zanuhev and greeted him in a friendly manner, saying it was nice to meet you and calling an inaudible name. A second later, the stranger coughed and apologized for mispronouncing information about himself. He cheerfully threw his giant sword over his shoulder and introduced himself as ASO, the god of this world where they were now. The girl behind her back shouted to her lord to let her go, encased in his power, and began to say that this guy had started their fight first. The girl's lord calmly asked her to moderate her ardor and calm down before she finally lost her representative face. ASO was silent for a while, obviously thinking about something, and then he said he would look into it. Zanhen saw him reach for his sword and remembered his words on some god, deciding to find out what he would do. Also loudly stuck his sword next to the terrified guy into the ground, and all he could hear was pleas for mercy and pitiful pleas not to hit him. The stranger started to say that the guy apparently didn't fully realize the whole situation, and would now try to explain otherwise. Aso looked into the man's frightened eyes, called him by name, and asked him to listen. He quickly stood up, picked up his sword, slung it back on his shoulder, and informed Zan that he had been chosen for the special place. Zanhev listened in surprise and wild shock, as a guy he had never met until today invited him to become his player. He was dumbfounded by the offer and wondered if it was just the name of a webtoon. Still, he received a sneer asking if he had read the information carefully. Zanhev didn't understand what it was about or what else it said, so he asked the so-called god of this world himself. Also, realizing that the surprised guy is out of the loop, decides to simplify his life and give him some answers, calling on the help of his powers. Oni quickly searches for something he needs on his tablet and agrees to bring him up to speed. ASO points out where to look and asks the guy to pay close attention to everything, since he will show it once. A broadcast begins, and Zan sees a huge column before him, which ASO calls the Sky Castle Terrarium. Next comes piles of golden weapons with various equipment, and an explanation that this dream castle is full of riches and a sweet sense of victory. Likewise, such characters want to ascend to this magical castle immediately. ASO goes on to explain that there are many such wannabes in his world, and they are simply called players. Having listened carefully from the beginning, Zanhev was surprised they were called just that, and even interjected. ASO smiled and said that it was exactly as he understood it, but there was more to it. He asked the guy to remember the player Dean had seen lying in the game arena after the defeat earlier. ASO also gave the example of the victor of the battles, the one who had defeated him so handily, a girl named Nagi. After a moment, the self-appointed god of this world leaned as close to the boy as possible and said he was among the players. Zanhev's face immediately changed from surprise to fear, and he crumpled in an attempt to say something, but he couldn't find the right words. The boy, gathering his courage, asked ASO if he would be a player like those people in the heavenly arena and heard an affirmative answer. ASO also added that the guy should recognize how cool it was, but all he heard in response was a timid attempt to explain something. Zanhev began to realize the seriousness of the situation, jumped up from his seat, and started yelling loudly like a madman, asking why he had chosen him. Also, he didn't understand this reaction to all his explanations and the unique opportunity to prove himself, so he simply asked him what he was talking about. Zanhev began to yell loudly that he had not asked for such a thing, and wondered why he was doing all this, since he did not want to fight those monsters again. As he ran closer to ASO, he continued to yell like a madman that he had the right to decide his fate. Why did he think he would do anything about it? ASO remained completely calm and simply asked the guy to answer his own question, who decided his fate in such a way. He clarified who exactly had made such a promise or had already forgotten. Still, the guy only looked at ASO in bewilderment, unsure what he was talking about. As ASO left, he reminded Zane of his comment on the Webtoon forum, "I'll wipe her out." He said he was pretty brave, even though Nagi was already in the terrarium. He added that this was why he needed to become a player. However, Zan was still shocked that this happened over some ridiculous comment. ASO returned to the upset man and asked if he had written it after thinking hard about the meaning and words. Zanhev didn't know what to say because he couldn't even imagine such a thing being real. Also, seeing his puzzled look, he laughed out loud and said that it was all a joke. Zan hesitantly asked if he was joking, but he heard that no one was forcing him to stay here and do anything. ASO argued that he could give up right now because after all it was up to him, but there was a but. He looked at Zan enigmatically and asked if he was really ready to return to his reality right now. At that moment, Zanhev seriously considered his reality, what good things awaited him there and whether he expected them. The boy sadly remembered his world, full of fools and foolish people who ran to insult him at the first opportunity and put him down for nothing. Zan sat silently and thought about Aso's unexpected but interesting proposal. The god of this world came closer to him and asked him if he was ready to return after giving him some time to think it over. Zanhev had already realized that this world was clearly not for him, though it was his reality, and he didn't belong there. He turned to the god, who quickly interrupted him, saying that Zan could call him Mr. ASO. The boy corrected himself and asked Aso-san what he would get as a reward if he could rise to first place. ASO cheerfully replied, clapping the lad on the shoulder, that he could get what he desired. He could already see Zan's clear approval of his offer, and he held out his hand in a friendly manner. Zanhev, no longer hesitating, extended his hand in return and informed him that they had agreed on everything in that case. ASO drew a large circle around Zan with his sword and said he would now use magic to send him to the tower with the others. He also said that this was the only time he would save him and that he would not be able to do it again, warning him to be careful there. Aso-san swung his hand with a magic stream to perform the move as a surprised Zan yelled for him to stop. Also, he didn't understand why he did that. He wanted to do one cool thing, but Zan wasn't interested because he didn't want to go to the tower empty-handed. The Lord looked at the guy in bewilderment, who indignantly said that such an irresponsible thing to do, and also calls himself a god. Zan added that even novice trainers get their first Pokemon, and asked ASO to give him something. ASO was about to say he had nothing to offer him when he heard someone's disgruntled voice. That voice turned out to be the girl who had tried to strangle him before the god intervened, saying that she had been quietly listening to them the whole time. When the long-haired girl emerged from her fiery confinement, Zanhev immediately realized who was standing before them. She had a malicious attitude and asked menacingly why this foolish kid was treating the Lord like some kind of friend. Zanhev quickly realized that she was not to be trifled with and was visibly frightened because he could sense such malicious energy from the girl. This atmosphere was very familiar to him as he remembered his popular classmates, or rather, the main characters of the class. The girl used one of her powers, forcibly twisting and bowing the guy to herself, and ordered him to behave normally. Zanhev, not in control of his body, quickly agreed with everything the girl told him, much to Aso's amusement. After looking at the boys for a while longer, the Lord laughed loudly and got their attention. He laughed non-stop, saying in short intervals that they both looked funny and ridiculous. Moments later, when the girl left the guy alone and removed her charms, Aso said that a great solution had occurred to him. He repeated Zanahev's request to take something with him to the tower so that he wouldn't go there empty-handed. The boy stared at the Lord in amazement as he came closer and closer and finally embraced the long-haired girl. Mr. Aso cheerfully shouted to Zanu that he could take the long-haired girl with him. The girl was shocked by such an offer from her lord and stared at the guy silently. Zanhev was no less stunned than she was by such words from the god of this mysterious world. The guy stepped back a couple of meters in fury and started shouting at the same time as the girl that it would not happen. The Lord's ward began begging not to bring her down to earth with this inconsiderate man. He then started yelling that he didn't want to go anywhere with this mad woman. Aso-san took turns listening to both of them complain to each other and tried to calm them down somehow, saying that everything would be fine. After a second, he pushed the girl into the circle drawn around Zan earlier, saying he had already decided. The ward had not expected this turn of events. It fell right into the circle, still trying to persuade the Lord to change his mind while he was already speaking his farewell speech. ASO chuckled merrily as he looked at the frightened players and wished them a good time. As a farewell, he called out that the girl's name was Escalibra and said that his unique sword might come in handy too. Escalibra didn't seem to care what he would give them at all, just as long as he didn't leave her with him to her fate. Aso-san only cheerfully added that they would each be charged an ice cream cone upon their return to him. With a snap of his fingers, he put his power into action. He started moving the guys inside, trying to figure out what was happening. Zanhev felt the changes in his body again, and the intense tingling like the lightning last time, and thought he could have thought of a more straightforward way to do it. Escalibra was experiencing new sensations and cried out in surprise, disappearing behind a pall of thick smoke. The boy looked around him and, not noticing the girl, began to call out to her, thinking what a stupid name she had. Escalibra looked at her hands in horror, not understanding anything, because she had never experienced anything like this before. The girl landed on the ground with Zan, looked at herself from head to toe, and yelled like a madwoman about why she looked so strange. The boy didn't say a word, but silently looked at his newfound partner in her dress and thought that she had even shrunk somehow. Zan noticed Escalibra's growing anger and asked her to calm down, calling her a child, which caused an even stronger surge of negative energy. The girl was simply furious and lashed out at Zan, blaming him for everything that had happened to her. She made her first punch at his face. Mr. Aso was watching everything from his monitor and remembered forgetting to tell them something. The guy tried to calm his partner down by asking her what this place was and who lived there, since they had already arrived. Mr. Aso would not let them go and had prepared something interesting for them because he thought their stay there without trials would be boring. Right behind the players, a huge, evil monster that Aso had prepared as a training quest appeared at the same second. Escalibra still couldn't calm down and shouted that she didn't care where they ended up because she was small now. The girl was even more annoyed by Zan's silence and asked him why he was silent, unless, of course, he was scared of her. She hadn't noticed the monster behind her, which Zan had already seen, and rushed away, shouting at the girl to run away. Somewhere nearby, one of the locals was watching the guys and had already cursed the guy for warning his partner. Zanhev stood in surprise at the explosion before him and immediately called out to Escalibra. The girl had already approached Zan, and he worriedly asked her if she was all right, hearing back that she hadn't noticed him immediately. The guy started asking loudly who was hiding there and why he attacked them for no reason. The unknown man in the wild animal costume snapped angrily, because he was unhappy with the players' questions. In a second, both guys were surrounded on all sides by numerous warriors in identical clothing, asking what they were doing here and who they were. One of the players, introduced to the system as a red wolf from the Munch class, said they would pay for breaking into this place. Zanhev, who had never been caught in detailed packs, was visibly scared, unlike the brave Escalibra within the system. The partners heard someone ask them if they were ready, and afterward commanded the others to grab the girl. The armed local players rushed towards Escalibra to fulfill their ringleader's hopes. Zanhev kept repeating in consternation what they should do now, to which his partner asked him to shut up, saying that this was why she didn't like the land. The girl still couldn't stop being angry with Zan and yelled insults at him first, and then something to hold on to tighter. The guy looked at his partner in bewilderment and didn't understand what she asked him to hold. The whole place lit up with bright flames at that very second, blinding all the players standing nearby. Zanhev immediately eyed everything cautiously, but after a moment he began to recognize the many in front of him. Through the disappearing flames and smoke, something similar to a flaming sword began to appear in the surprised guy's hand. The players who wanted to attack them stopped and began considering what was wrong with them and who they might actually be. Zan saw the powerful weapon in his hands after a moment and decided that he could now defeat anyone. One of the attackers gave the command to leave, looked at his sword, and began to speculate. Aso-san on the screen was watching everything with special interest, chuckling snidely. After a short while, the mighty weapon in young Zan's hands turned into a very ordinary sword, shaking along with him. Everyone nearby on the field, including the boy himself, was discussing what had suddenly happened to him and where all the power had gone. The system explained that the sword was an extension of Escalibra and was called a sword with a soul, or simply personality. This legendary sword grows stronger with its owner and has unlimited abilities in battle and beyond. Aso-san, the system's operator, continued to say that it was now understood that the sword had taken over the characteristics of the current owner. All Aso-san had previously said meant only one thing: the sword was now as weak and trembling as its owner. The system presented the guy as a Zanhev player with an apprentice class and a rookie rank, and he thought he was definitely finished now. Hearing all the explanations the master had given through the system about the sword made Escalibra wildly terrified. The girl collapsed to the ground and hugged her knees, thinking only of how insignificant and powerless she was now. It depressed her more and more every second. Zan gently approached the girl and began to ask what they should do now, but Escalibra wasn't going to do anything else. She wanted to be alone and head back home. The leader of the locals, who were still about to attack them, coughed loudly as if to remind them of his existence. He loudly addressed his partners about how stupid everything had gotten because they were wondering what they were, but it turned out they were just trash. The leader finally said that they would pay for sneaking into the Red Hood's territory since it had turned out that way. Zan could not repeat what the leader had said while the other players dreamed of a quick, bloody massacre of their enemies. At this point, the kid heard someone suggest that they should do their peeps first and decided it was just a bunch of psychos. Zan seemed confused, but he clearly realized that if he was destroyed here, no one else could do it for him, which is why it was urgent to get out of here. While the guy was having a conversation with himself in his head, he noticed Escalibra walking past him and called out her name. The girl was already in a rage as she approached the players who had just insulted her and was about to take action. She was furious that the enemies had put her on the same level as this loser and started showering them with insults. The enemy team quickly sensed changes from the fragile Escalibra, against whom even standing was hard, and realized she was one of the players. Aso-san noted that the girl could retain some of his strength after all. Escalibra pointed her hand at the enemy army and told them with all the anger in the world to rest in peace. In that second, a massive explosion came from her, blinding everyone around her and pushing them off in different directions. The attacker's commander watched her abilities with bated breath, saying he had never seen anything like this before. One of his subordinates shouted that now was not the best time to admire and that she needed to run, while the girl went into lust for destruction mode with a grimace of terror. Escalibra heard the opponent's intentions and shouted that it was too late, but this outcome did not suit Mr. ASO. The god of this world quickly pressed something on his control panel, and the girl's power was completely gone in that second. Excalibur immediately became angry because she didn't understand what was going on and because she thought this shouldn't be happening. At the same time, she raised her head and smiled shyly, noticing the entire armed squad of opponents looking at her. The commander of the enemy fighters menacingly commanded them all to start destroying the outsiders, and they obediently agreed. Zanhen didn't understand why the girl couldn't use her power anymore, but he would leave quickly. The guy stopped and decided to go back because he couldn't leave alone and he just had to help. A moment later, the armed army commander froze and trembled as if struck by lightning. The same thing happened to Zanhev, but it was already a very familiar feeling for him. This action affected everyone except Excalibur, and she decided that they were all trembling out of fear of her. The girl turned to Zan irritably, saying there was nothing left for them to do but fight, and asked him to take on one or two of the smaller warriors. While yelling, she didn't immediately notice that her partner had magically disappeared somewhere. The girl yelled so loudly that it seemed to be heard by the players even from the tower. Zanhev was already running away quickly through the forest, still hearing the loud insults from his partner. He thought he wasn't quite out of his mind to fight them, as he realized he wouldn't have a bone in his body after such a battle. As he ran forward, he realized that the screams had stopped, and for a moment he thought that the girl had been captured by the enemy. Zan remembered how he had thought that something was bound to change in his life after entering this world. He decided to quickly forget those thoughts and not think about useless things because she was strong enough, and he would only hinder her. The guy fell to the ground face down, with thoughts that in the end, a weak and cowardly person like him just ran away. He lay there, thinking there was nothing to be considered with this. He had already decided and done everything himself. After all, if you think about it, what could he be like? Being an ordinary schoolboy, unlike the rest of the characters in this webtoon. Zanhev couldn't think of anything better than feeling sorry for himself, thinking about how bad things had gotten, and that he could do nothing about it. He thought he was sitting alone in the school restroom again for a moment, thinking about his fate as a loser who didn't fit in with anyone. Standing on his knees with his head down, Zan believed this was best for everyone. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice and saw someone asking him if he was running away again. The next was a very familiar insult he heard from Kim Tavon while he was standing leaning against the school restroom door. At that moment, Zan had an inexplicable urge to prove the opposite to everyone. Still, he didn't know precisely how to go about it yet. Meanwhile, the captain was talking about the exhausted Excalibur and her fatigue. However, he thought such a pathos and self-confident girl could give something worthy. The enemy team had cornered Excalibur with no energy, talking about her weakness. The girl might have been tired, but she did not give up her position in the conversation. She replied that there was no way she should be saying such words to someone whose subordinates did everything for her. She couldn't stop thinking about how much this commander annoyed her. As he stood over her, he said that he even felt a little sorry for the life of such a little girl. The commander was already swinging his fist for a decisive blow, and the girl only thought about how nice it would be to use her power. Suddenly, from nowhere, Zanhev appeared before Excalibur and covered her with himself. The commander noticed him at the same time as the girl, and though their emotions were different, he didn't hold back his strike. The commander threw a powerful punch, raising dust around him and causing a bright flash of blinding light. The commander was already standing proudly after the attack, hoping for his victory over two players at once. The girl immediately perked up and jumped under Zan's body, collapsing on top of her. She screamed and asked why he had come back if he kept running away like the last loser. She couldn't calm down and kept asking the guy why he was here, adding that she could have done it without his help. Zanhev, who had just received a hard blow, simply told her she couldn't even be a loser anymore. She noticed the barely held back tears on his face and stopped yelling, quickly changing her expression and tone. Excalibur asked him to move away and let her stand up, saying it was not illegal to be a loser. Unexpectedly, the girl reached out her hand to Zan and asked him to hold her hand to help him stand up. The guy was still looking at her in surprise, not realizing if she was serious, hearing further the suggestion to try again. Zanhev realized that Excalibur was serious and accepted her offer to try again, holding her hand in return. Suddenly, a blinding stream of light descended on the players, accompanied by the announcement that they have passed. The enemy army commander was genuinely surprised as he tried to understand what this power was and how it could even be possible. Zanhen stood bravely before everyone with a burned vest on his forearm and a mighty sword. The guy promised to rise to a place of honor among the players. Escalibra thought angrily that she had only given her partner half her power. Seeing how powerful the guy was, the girl was furious that he had taken all the god power left in her. Zanhev first offered Escalibra's sword power, but she still gave him a chance to prove himself, and now he stood in flaming light before his opponents. One of the enemy army told the other not to hide behind everyone, but to move forward since he was so huge. They were already trying to move closer to Zan reluctantly, but the commander ordered them all to move back immediately, adding that he would handle him on his own. The commander said menacingly that he hated most of all those who only knew how to rely on their useless bling. He said that was why he had created his own thieves' guild, but Zan thought he was just talking nonsense. It was as if the commander was seriously focused on something and asked his worthless partners to examine the use of true power. He summoned his best techniques and magic skills for the coming battle to emerge victorious. The subordinates shouted praises to their great commander, who never doubts himself, and quickly dispersed so as not to disturb him. The leader menacingly told Zan that he was not interested in what this supposedly mighty sword was called, because to him it was just a knife. He also added, raising a huge stone, that it wouldn't do any good if he couldn't get close to his opponent. The commander brought the block of stone right above Zan and said he would die quietly now and sell his precious sword. The boy stood calmly and watched the huge stone rapidly approaching him. A moment later, Zanhev swung his majestic sword towards the flying block of stone. The guy turned towards the enemy team, showing his superiority with his appearance. The commander did not expect such a turn of events and froze in surprise with wide-open eyes. He and his subordinates tried to see what was happening in the bluish glow's light. Zanhev was not as simple as they all thought, and he shocked them by delivering a devastating, fiery sword strike. The enemy army scattered from the powerful attack in different directions, trembling and shaking from such a blow. The brave kid stood in a fighting stance after the first strike, which was such a successful strike in his rather dull life up to that point. After a second, he raised his head, and his face showed signs of fatigue from the sudden force that had come upon him. Zanhev only managed to utter what he could and could no longer keep his exhausted body on its feet. The P-boy plopped down on the ground where he made a sound hole with his sword. A few meters away from Zan himself, the entire enemy team lay motionless and without signs of life, crushed by his majestic blow. The in-world system announced the successful completion of the elimination of the Red-Hooded Thieves Guild. Meanwhile, Aso-san watched the whole event and laughed merrily, finding it amusing. As he watched the broadcast on his cell phone screen, he was very happy that it had become much more interesting and unpredictable. Also, he relaxed back on the couch and exhaled deeply, tossing his cell phone behind his back. The Lord seemed to have already thought of some plan of action and was about to put it into action. He sat in front of the chessboard, folding his hands before him, and thought how good it was that all the necessary candidates had finally been assembled. ASO decided with a satisfied smirk that it would finally begin its next move. Somewhere in one of the universes, an unknown person was leisurely traveling somewhere on a go-kart, in a harness with a creature that looked like a fluffy cloud. The cheerful and cute fluffy creature was referred to by the intra-world system as a mokiko. Behind the tightly clutched rein sat a confident old man, silently driving his cart. The old man turned out to be 86-year-old Julius II, a coachman who had recently experienced a crisis in his peaceful life. The cause of this crisis occurred about 30 minutes ago when he was calmly brushing his mokiko and was about to return, but something happened. The old man was standing by his faithful pet, minding his own business, when he heard an unfamiliar voice asking his grandfather for a ride to the village around the tower. The old man snapped back, saying they should look for their own grandfather to give them a ride to wherever they needed to go. Suddenly, the old man heard something that made him stop and be distracted by the travelers. A formidable Escalibra with a sack in the skin of a beast was walking towards Julius. She was dragging a barely alive Zan along the road and answered that she personally had no grandfather. The girl stopped in front of the old man and asked if it was impossible to get on the wagon without her grandfather, to which the frightened Julius quickly said that it was not necessary, he would drive them anyway. The old man invited the uninvited travelers into his wagon and hovered a while, waking up after the girl called him loudly. Escalibra pulled Zan into the cart and settled herself in. She told the old man to hurry up and get them where they needed to go, and the man moved off apologetically. The old man was furious, but he didn't show it in any way. He only thought that if he were 50 years younger, he would have pointed her out. He stealthily watched the worried girl desperately trying to bring her partners to their senses. Escalibra was shaking Zan by the collar of his shirt when he accidentally snapped something there, while the old man thought he would just stay out of anything. The girl stared silently at the guy lying unconscious and with no visible signs of life. She figured Zan hadn't moved once yet since he'd lost consciousness after his devastating blow. Escalibra gently reached out to touch her partner's head, sincerely hoping he wasn't dead. It was as if the girl was clarifying to herself that she wasn't particularly concerned about his fate, but about her continued stay here and the possibility of returning to the god. While she was immersed in her musings, the guy jumped up with the words, "Squid fried rice," and got a fist to the head in surprise. Zan startled the girl, and she casually punched him, asking if he really didn't remember anything. The guy revealed that his last memory was of taking her hand, and the next thing he knew, it was darkness. This made his partner laugh, who thought he'd be good for it. Zan added that despite everything, he still remembered something about something incredibly cool and powerful happening to her. Escalibra asked him to forget about it because it would be useless if he couldn't remember exactly how he'd done it. Zan sincerely apologized for it. The girl thought it could just be an accident. A moment later, Escalibra still decided that it couldn't be an accident after all. Her power couldn't be used just because of some luck. The girl thought that although he looked like a nerd outwardly, he did what he had to do at the moment, which required maximum output. Zan Hev didn't completely destroy any of the enemy opponents, only crippling them and leaving them alive. This guy could somehow, in some incomprehensible way, completely control the majestic power of a god. As the girl continued to ponder, her partner shouted that he remembered something else, immediately drawing all of her attention to himself. Zan began to mumble and squirm, saying it might not be important, but the girl wanted to know what it was about. She pressed him to talk about it, and he remembered he had missed something when she reached out to him. Zan Hev timidly looked straight into the girl's eyes and thanked her for believing in him, no matter what. Escalibra had expected anything but that and looked at her partner, confused. The guy held out his hand to her and tried unsuccessfully to say her name, which pissed her off. She shouted that he couldn't even learn her name. Zan replied that he remembered her name well, but it was so ridiculous and strange that the old man thought they were too loud and wanted to return to the village as soon as possible. The spirited girl seemed angry and shouted that he had a strange name. Still, Zan only defended himself against her swinging and said that his mother had named him that. The boy didn't seem to be listening to his crazy partner anymore and stared off in surprise. He asked her to look forward, but she kept yelling and threatening that if he didn't shut up, she would beat him up right here and now. The guy interrupted her again and told her that this was not the right time and that he wasn't talking about that at all, forcing his partner to turn around after all. The guys saw a narrow path in front of them, with a few more wagons arranged in a single row towards some kind of entrance. The old man's wagon and his partners were approaching the village at the tower entrance. At the front of the narrow path, guards stood at the main gate and took turns letting the wagons pass, writing something down on paper. Zanhev quickly realized that it was some sort of checkpoint and why he panicked. The guy immediately looked around at the things he'd gotten here with, which included only his cell phone and gel pen, and wondered what he should do now. He started saying that maybe he should get a part-time job if they accept minors, which made the girl laugh a lot. The guy hadn't paid attention to the things in the wagon before, and now, looking at his partner, he asked if she had stolen it all from those thieves. When Zan nodded in the affirmative, he immediately gave up looking at the contents of the sack full of gold. He said he didn't have to worry about the money. He praised the girl, saying that he had never thought she would be capable of such a thing, but she didn't see it as a big deal and asked him to listen to what she had to say from now on. Escalibra had already started making plans, saying they would first find a place to eat a nice meal. At that moment, everyone heard a loud shout that it was them and turned around to see the old man telling the guards to capture them immediately. The old man did not hold back and told the strict guard that the two men had threatened him and forced him to take them here. Escalibra shouted back that there were no threats, and she was just asking him, which he immediately agreed to. Zan got scared that she might have actually threatened the old man and started yelling that he was unconscious in the first place, and therefore also a victim. The girl could not tolerate such insolent behavior and kicked him in the face with all her might. The guards were watching and said there was no need to pretend, as they knew they were in on it. One of the guards pulled out a wanted flyer with a member of the Thieves Guild on it and said that this was proof that they were from the Red Hoods. The old man started shouting that he recognized the petty thieves immediately, but they tried to fight back, saying they had nothing to do with that guild. In that second, They both realized how awkward they looked, for they were wearing the stolen clothes of the Thieves' Guild after the battle. The guard came closer to his partners and said that he immediately thought the cloak looked very familiar, and shouting, asked if they had lost their fear. The chief quickly commanded all the armed guards to surround the wagon with the brazen thieves. Escalibra quickly looked over to the frightened Zan and realized what an awkward situation they were in. The boy felt something in his body again and looked at his trembling hands in confusion. A mysterious stranger was watching everything happening from a bird's-eye view. Standing on a high cliff, proudly folding his arms across his chest, he was about to check something right now. Zanhev stared fearfully at his hands and remained motionless and silent. The tourists passing by heard some noise at the gate and became interested in the showdown, figuring there were just some intruders. Escalibra heard them calling them children and was about to catch them. Still, she felt even a little sorry that they had no idea who they were messing with. The girl quickly thought about her partner, or rather, whether he would run off again in a panic attack and leave her alone. Escalibra suddenly noticed how the guy started shivering and shaking again and became frightened. Zanhev, meanwhile, was trying his best to regain his composure and calm down a little. He was determined to not run away again, even though he was ashamed that he wanted to hide. He would not do it again. Zan looked back at the guards and thought they had been stopped simply because they were mistaken for criminals. But if everything was explained normally, they would be fine. The head guard menacingly commanded the smaller ruffians to keep their hands behind their heads and slowly climb down from the wagon, to which Zan shouted in agreement. The boy turned to Escalibra, not to be afraid or worried. Because he had an idea, even though it was scary, he asked her to leave the matter to him. Zan didn't even have time to finish his thought to his partner when he saw her abruptly fly upwards out of the wagon. The maddened girl told the guards that they were in trouble today, for they had no idea who was before them, and began to hurl threats at them. Zan resented the stubborn and unyielding girl who could not be bothered. While he was judging her reckless actions, she had already attacked one of the guards. Standing on him, Escalibra loudly announced that the first one was ready, and felt a kind of power. Incomparable, of course, with her past power, but also very good. The girl decided that it would be quite enough, even without the god power that Zanhev had used, and called the rest of the guards over to her. The head guard shouted to the steel ones that she wasn't one of the players, and they should all attack her together to deny her the opportunity to destroy them alone. Excalibur was interested in what the soldier had said about the players, and recalled that Mr. ASO had also said something about it. Armed guards with spears ran forward with an attack, while the girl said that although she didn't know much about these players, she would show them something else. Escalibra threw off her animal cloak as she walked and told them that she was much stronger than some of the players, according to a secret known only to them. The head guard, hit in the face by the cape, shouted that he couldn't see anything and only heard a subordinate's warning. Escalibra took advantage of the moment of surprise and snatched the spear from the temporarily sightless guard, jumping away from him sharply. The girl quickly located the point she needed and took aim, swinging the sharp spear. She deftly swung the weapon straight at one of the guards, blocking their path. The spear reached its target in a flash, and the guard shuddered in pain and twisted in half. The weapon hit across right into the soldier's stomach and threw him far back at high speed. At this moment, Escalibra thought that they were weaker than even that red-hooded guild, and that if they continued like this, it wouldn't be that hard to reach the first rank. The guards looked at each other warily and prepared for another attack, still thinking the enemies were planning something against them. A guard shouted to one of the team members to quickly run out and get Mr. Rang here. While he was telling the soldier this, the girl was already flying at him with her fists in a fury. Escalibra menacingly asked which other Rana they were talking about and ordered them to bring him straight to her. While the guard tried to defend himself, the girl said that she could at least have a normal conversation with him. At the same time, Zan tried to call her distraught partner to talk her out of it, but he couldn't pronounce her difficult name. Suddenly, the girl was distracted from everything when she heard someone call her Kaylee and tell her to be careful. Escalibra was too late to notice, and she could not have dodged the blow behind her from the already armed guard preparing to attack. The girl quickly realized how this could have ended if it weren't for one thing. She heard Zane's loud call to battle, calling her by her abbreviated name, Kaylee, and was forced to respond. The girl began to vaporize and move to another place in front of the astonished guards, who were already swinging to strike. She was already a battle buddy in Zan's hands a moment later, like a majestic sword. But even here, Escalibra couldn't calm down and started shouting at the guy who had called her out for being a hero without permission. She also clarified that she had seen the attackers behind her. The sword girl added that everything was fine and under control, but Zan interrupted her and said that wasn't true at all. She started shouting, asking why he suddenly thought he could cross her and know anything at all about it, being a typical loser. The guy calmly replied that it was precisely because he was a loser that he understood everything, and asked if she knew the most important thing about it. The girl asked in bewilderment what he meant, and Zan told her it was the look. He explained that just as prey catches the gaze of the predators surrounding it in the classroom, you can tell who the biggest fish are by their eyes. Zanhev shifted his gaze from his sword and stared ahead, saying his underdog instinct told him only one thing. In front of his partner stood a huge, stern-looking man surrounded by a serpentine dragon, and the guy seriously added that this man was hazardous to them. Escalibra, unaccustomed to herself, listened attentively to her partner and agreed with him. The girl wanted to say something else, but suddenly noticed something strange. Escalibra looked under her feet and saw the ground split in half. No one standing nearby understood how the ground had split apart. A second later, an intra-world announcement announced that Mr. Rand had entered the battle, and everyone who was there shouted to run away quickly. Mr. Rand, gathering back his endless dissection belt, said that next time, there would be no such thing. Zanhev thought with delight and admiration that cutting the ground with some cloth like that was cool. Escalibra shouted from her sword that the guy should quickly gather himself and not be afraid of anything. Zan replied that he was unafraid of anything and was fully prepared for the fight. The girl warned her partner to be especially wary of that cloth of Mr. Rand's, because if it wrapped around him, he was definitely finished. Zan grudgingly said that even a toddler would understand, but all he could think about was how scared he was. He kept thinking that now he wouldn't even be able to escape and would have to fight, and Escalibra was so heavy. He couldn't understand how the god Aso could easily control it, as if it weighed nothing. It was hard to stand with it. The boy stopped halfway and seemed to think about something, looking at Ran-san. Kaylee quickly reminded her partner that he could use his level for only 2 minutes, and told him to stop thinking so much and start acting. Zanhev was still hesitant about this decision and decided to clarify if it was mandatory to fight him. The sword girl became angry and yelled that it was the dumbest question she had ever heard because they had been through so much already, and he still didn't understand anything. Zan quickly interrupted her, saying that wasn't what he meant at all. He honestly admitted that he was really afraid to fight, but that wasn't the point. He just really didn't understand why they should get into a battle. Escalibra still didn't understand what her partner was talking about, and he tried to explain it to her. Zan began to say that their main goal was to get into the tower and find Nagi there. Still, if they got into a fight now, it was unlikely that they could get into the city around the tower. He added that even if they were to get lucky and defeat Ran, he would shut down again like last time, and the game would end. Escalibra still grudgingly wondered what he would do then, if he wasn't thinking of just dropping dead here right now. Mr. Rand had grown tired of his opponent's idle chatter and decided to move to action. Escalibra immediately sensed something was wrong and looked straight towards the enemy. A huge hand had formed from Mr. Ran's endless belt of cleavage and was already moving towards the guys while the girl shouted to her partner to look forward. The gentlemen began to list their crimes, namely attacking a checkpoint and obstructing duty. A huge hand hung in the air above Zan as Rand finished listing their crimes, ending with an attempt on the guards' lives. A moment later, the endless belt was already swirling around the surprised boy. Another second later, the cloth completely wrapped Zan's body tightly with no way to get out of it. Mr. Rand began to menacingly read out their rights and duties, according to which they had the right to remain silent. He next said that if they disobeyed, authorized player Rand had the right to take the following action. The Lord clutched his cloth tighter and informed them that he had the right to enforce the annihilating reprisal. All this time, Zanhev stood motionless with his sword under the effect of the endless belt. The bound fellow quickly realized something was wrong and something strange was happening. At this time, Zan saw no one but Mr. Rand, as if only the two of them were left in the world, and pitch blackness all around. The guy sensed that the atmosphere was weighty in the presence of this lord, and he understood how the players became after raising the tower. Suddenly, the lad interrupted his thoughts at the word players and tried to remember what Aso had said about it. Escalibra inquired about his partner's condition, but he replied only that he could not move. The infinity belt broke into small pieces in that second and flew apart, freeing Zan from captivity. Mr. Rand said menacingly, warning him not to resist, let alone free himself. He went on to say that according to their law, he must punish him for all he had done. Escalibra began to call out to her partner and try to say something. Still, he only shouted to her that he knew everything himself. She did finish, clarifying that now was not the best time to quarrel over nothing, or they would both be killed. The girl once again, looking toward her opponent, said they had to fight. At the same instant, the sword majestically ignited a powerful flame in Zan's hands in a light of paralyzing lightning and blinding light. Escalibra felt powerful energy and strength and couldn't contain her elation. Mr. Ran, who had remained completely calm until that moment, went into a stage of mild anxiety from the power he had just seen. The distraught Zan Hev felt his body overflowing with energy, realizing that this was the god power Escalibra had spoken of earlier. He silently looked at his mighty sword and was sure they would win with it. Zan Hev pushed himself powerfully off the ground in a high jump and looked in surprise at the people standing below. The guy didn't understand what they were doing there and why they were still standing there and not dispersing. Escalibra interrupted his partner's musings, asking what he was doing since no one could stop such a powerful force that way. Zan was already flying downwards from the decline of his power when Kaylee told him to stop doubting, unless he wanted to die before they finished him off, of course. The guy didn't attack as he was afraid that other people would get hurt, but Mr. Rand still didn't understand why his opponent wasn't attacking. Ran was already flying towards Zan and said he had no idea what he was up to, but he had clearly missed his only chance to win. The Lord had already swung his fist towards the boy for a strike. Zan knew he wouldn't have time to dodge and took the decisive blow that made his head black. The boy flew down from the tree and fell to the ground with a thud. The guys watching nearby sympathized with Zan, or instead with his fall from such a height, and discussed whether he had survived. Mr. Ran, while still in the air, thought that Zan Hev was dangerous. He looked at the man who had fallen from such a height, managed to survive, and considered him a challenging opponent. Mr. Ran wouldn't wait for the man to come to his senses. He was about to deliver the next crushing blow. Zan Hev was still and unconscious and lying on the ground with no visible signs of life. Escalibra angrily thought she had undersighted him, as she had never even imagined such a thing could happen. Meanwhile, Mr. Rand didn't waste a second and had already launched his webbing towards his partners. Escalibra immediately realized she wouldn't have time to get out or save her buddy. She simply closed her eyes to face the approaching end. A short time later, the girl opened her eyes to see why nothing had happened. Escalibra saw the old man's mochiko appear in front of her out of nowhere and called out to her, calling her curly-haired girl. The fluffy cloud stood flat before her partner and didn't move, mooing merrily. Mr. Ron froze with surprise, as he had not expected to see a mochiko in his path, and asked why this animal was here. The guys looking out from behind the bushes were also trying to figure out why the mochiko was defending her partners and interfering in the fight, since it was the first time they had seen such a thing. Escalibra sat down next to the mochiko, while the guys shouted that the fight was unlikely to continue now, because, even with all Mr. Rana's severity, he would not do such a thing. The girl continued to sit next to the animal and thought about the strange atmosphere there. It looked very much like Mr. Rand wouldn't just stand there and calmly observe everything, because he was probably preparing to attack. Mochiko stood before the girl and guy and repeated her MO. The Lord couldn't take it all anymore and told the animal to shut up immediately. Mochiko mewed loudly as Ron launched his endless belt of dissection straight into Escalibra, knocking her off her feet and throwing her back towards the guy. The unconscious girl quickly flew toward her lying partner from the hard blow. Mochiko continued to moo loudly as Mr. Rand commanded his subordinates, who had already fled to follow orders, to send the partners to jail and punish them according to the law. Escalibra, along with her partner Zanhev, was thrown into one of the cells behind bars. Both players were in the local village at the tower entrance prison. Someone laughed very loudly upon hearing the simply unbelievably rambling story. The unknown man asked Ransan again if the Mochiko had blocked him while protecting the criminals, and heard a quiet assent in response. He further questioned if he had accidentally attacked the innocents. Otherwise, why on earth would the Mochiko stand in their defense? But Ron was sure they were criminals since they had attacked the main gate. Mr. Ran, after a bit of silence, added that he still had something else as evidence. He held out the tie he had found in the wagon, which Kaylee had accidentally broken the clasp on while bringing Zan to his senses. He said that he had never seen such tailoring before. Ran caught the unknown man's attention, adding that there could be no mistake and that something was wrong with them. The unknown man turned out to be Dean, who had fought Nagi and said he hadn't even hoped to see the kid again. Mr. Ran was very surprised and asked if he knew him. He heard an explanation that he was the same guy who broke through Nagi's wall of blue flame. Mr. Rand couldn't believe his ears, and Dean confirmed everything to him again. After some thought, Dean informed Rand that he'd just have to visit him in person. The local jail was multi-story and securely barred behind an iron gate with an alarm system. At the windows of one of the cells behind the bars, two furry mooks stood mooing and mooing. Zan Hen and Escalibra had already come to their senses and sat silently on opposite sides of the cell. The boy broke the silence and spoke first, saying this was a boring prison. The guy said she was incredible in battle and defeated so many guards, and that player Ran wasn't as tough as he initially thought. Zan had said that if he had executed his attack better, they would have won, but none of that seemed to interest the girl. Escalibra leaned against the cold wall of the cell and sighed loudly. Zanhev visibly became nervous and worried as he was already familiar with this situation. The guy was sure his partner was furious, and now he would be finished. Zan even had time to think it was logical, because he would have hated himself for such a thing. In his mind, he quickly recalled the picture of the time when he had risen mightily above everyone else, full of strength and energy, and was sure that if he hadn't been stuck there, they would have won. Zan didn't even notice the rage filling his mind and body, and began desperately banging his head against the wall with thoughts that he'd better end it all himself right now. While the guy indulged in self-deprecation, he was accosted by a bewildered Escalibra. The girl hesitated momentarily, but she apologized a few seconds later. Zan changed from anger to surprise and stared at his partner, not fully realizing what he had just heard. The guy immediately rushed to Kaylee's side and began repeating her words, asking what she was apologizing to him for. Escalibra was really very depressed and only said that either he was a fool since he didn't understand anything, or he just wanted to comfort her. The girl added that she is just accepting reality. After all, she was the one who got into the fight first, so she is the one who needs to apologize. She asked her partner if he understood the meaning of what she said. Escalibra seriously stated that she would not limit herself to just words but would take full responsibility, which surprised Zane even more. After a minute, the girl asked him to hit her once, pointing her finger at her cheek. The boy stared at Kaylee in shock and asked her if she had just asked him to hit her, to which she nodded approvingly. Zan thought he was beginning to understand a little bit why she was always lashing out at everyone. She didn't have any options other than to solve everything with a fight. He wondered what words he could use to convince her of that decision. Zan decided to do things his way again and called out to her affectionately, calling her Kaylee. She looked at the guy with surprised eyes again, just like the first time, and he asked permission to call her that. Zan began to explain that her name was too long and complicated for him, and when he tried to call her, he kept stuttering, so instead of fighting, he let her give him permission. Escalibra was still silently staring in amazement at the guy who kept saying that she could always say no if she didn't like something. Kaylee turned away and replied that she didn't care and would allow it. The important thing was that they worked things out. Zan was about to get excited when he heard the girl say that they still had something to work out. Kaylee pounded her fist on the wall menacingly and told him the most important thing was to get out of here quietly. Armed guards stood at the entrance gate to the prison corridor with the cells. The guys had been there for quite some time, and one had even dozed off. The guard quickly woke up when he heard a familiar voice asking him if his work was too tiring. They were startled to see Mr. Ran and Mr. Ding in front of them, looking at each other in surprise. The guards quickly apologized for dozing off at their post. Still, Mr. Ding asked them to relax and report on the situation around them. Mr. Rand said the only thing quiet and empty in these fools' heads was their heads, which scared his subordinates. Dean asked to leave all this worthless chatter and asked where those criminals who were caught this morning at the main gate were. The guard quickly said that they had them and that he would now show everything, but no sooner had he finished than suddenly everyone heard a loud bang and turned around at the noise. The prison cell where the partners were imprisoned already had a massive hole in the wall. The guards started begging to be destroyed, but Dean was only interested in the power that could make such a huge hole in the wall. Mr. Dean looked somewhere in the distance and said that because of all the commotion, there was only one thing left for them to do. Dean motioned to the guards to catch them again as the partners quickly raced away from the prison. An exhausted Zan, lying on the girl's shoulder, asked her to be a little slower as the strain was too much to bear after using the force. While Kylie asked him to be a little patient, Mr. Rand was already standing before them with a strange power emanating from his hand. Escalibra stopped in horror before her foe, and Zan flew to the ground. She tried to move, but realized she couldn't and felt a tremendous heaviness throughout her body. The boy, though, lay powerless on the ground. He could feel his body welling up as if poured with lead, and he wondered what that power was. Zan quickly tried to move his fingers and realized that his hands were moving normally, which meant one thing. Mr. Ran approached the boy in a crouch, but Zan continued his musings. Zan realized that it wasn't his body that had become heavy, but his clothes prevented him from moving. Ran sternly told them to give up, as he had already tagged their belongings, which meant he had total control over them for the next few hours. The boy angrily explained that they were not from the Thieves' Guild and had simply come here to climb the tower. Mr. Ran thought about the guy's words momentarily, especially what he said about the tower. He replied that the village around the tower was full of insects just like them. Seeing the glow of the terrarium, he immediately dreamed of going there. Looking at an exasperated Kaylee, Ran continued that even if they were telling the truth, they all needed to surrender immediately. The Lord proudly explained that the tower was a place for players like him, not those who couldn't even fight back decently. Finally, he added that they would never be able to climb the tower. Suddenly, Mr. Dean appeared in front of Zan out of nowhere, shocking him. Dean cheerfully inquired if he was the same Zanhev who had destroyed the wall of blue flames. The guy, of course, immediately recognized Dean and couldn't hide his intense surprise. Zan quickly remembered the most unpleasant way Dean had lost his arm in the last battle. Mr. Dean cheerfully said it was a pleasure to finally meet him. The guy was still staring at him in shock when he told him his name, Dean. Mr. D explained to Zan and his partner that he was the king of this village around the terrarium tower. Zan's only thought then was that they couldn't even deal with one player, and now another one had shown up, and with what status? The partners' whole bodies ached from the opponent's force, but the guy still bravely asked what they would do to them. Dean looked at him in silence for a few moments, as if pondering the question himself, and chuckled loudly. The Lord looked down at the guy with Kaylee lying on the ground and cheerfully asked what he would do with them. The partners didn't have time to hear anything anymore, as they were struck by a huge hand, blacking out their consciousness for hours. Zanhev was in some room surrounded by caring women who were tidying up his appearance. Several other kids were on his bed, taking turns shouting their admiration for the guy who had just opened his eyes and was staring in shock at everything going on around him. The kids started asking the guy where he came from and why he had such strange and stupid clothes. Suddenly, behind Zan's back, Kaylee called out and offered him something to eat, saying that the food here was delicious. Zan started to ask her what was happening and where they were, but she calmly sipped her drink and said she didn't understand anything. Zan started shouting to his partner that now was not the best time for such antics, and that they should run away from these monsters as soon as possible. At the exact second, the guy heard a familiar voice behind him, which turned out to be Ran, asking if he was accidentally calling him a monster. The Lord told Zan that since he was already awake and alert, he should get up and follow him. Zan was still staring at him in bewilderment as he told him that Mr. Dean was already waiting for him at his place. The boy didn't want any more trouble, so he followed Ran up the long staircase somewhere. He sincerely didn't understand why Ran was so calm and didn't even look in his direction, even though he was ready to smash him on the wall a while ago. Zan was unhappy with the long climb up the stairs and resented Kaylee for not going with him. Without her, he felt he was just an idle schoolboy. He was snapped out of his musings by Ran informing him that they had arrived, stopping in front of one of the rooms. The gentleman politely opened the door before Zanhev and told him to go inside. The boy saw the brightly colored room but hesitated to enter it. At the window, Mr. Dean was sitting on a couch with the curtains fluttering in the cool breeze. He turned to Zan with a sly smile and summarized that the guy had come to see him after all. Dean began to tell how the still until recently unfamiliar guy had surprised him last time, not only him. He got up from the couch and approached Zane. He asked who had so unexpectedly broken the wall and run away, to which he heard a request for forgiveness for the ruined wall. Lord Dean clarified that it wasn't that at all, but that the wall wasn't easy to break. He decided to find out all at once and debated whether he had handled Naga's wall of blue flame the same way. Zan was very tense about the topic of conversation, especially when Dean put his hand on his shoulder and told him that his only downside was that he fainted after all his heroics. Dean was more interested in what it was that he had that ability than anything else. Mr. Dean caught Zanhev off guard with this question, or cornered him. The boy began to think quickly about how to react to all this and whether he should tell him the truth. He thought his story about being the city's king didn't sound like a lie. Otherwise, why would Mr. Rand be subject to him? Zan realized that if he mumbled, Dean would sense something amiss and get angry, so he decided that telling the truth seemed like the best choice. The man was still questioning whether he could tell everything, including that all his mighty power was just a gift from the god Aso. Zane also thought that Dean might simply not believe it all. After a few minutes, Mr. Dean asked the guy what he was so serious about, and if he didn't want to tell him, let him not tell him, which surprised the guy who didn't know it was possible. Dean cheerfully said that no one would forbid him from answering any way he wanted, and hiding his abilities was pretty wise until he became a player. Zan asked in bewilderment why he had to ask such questions, and then heard that Dean was just curious. The boy was perplexed and wondered why he had called him over. Mr. Dean replied that he had some business for him but gave him their stuff. Zan gently asked if Dean had given him their stuff, and if it meant the same thing. The guy excitedly exhaled as he heard Dean confirm that all charges against him and Kaylee had been dropped. Dean said that an old man had come in and explained to them that they were not members of the Red Hoods Guild, much to Zane's surprise, since he had heard the old man accuse them himself. Dean replied that he didn't know of any such thing. He had only heard that the guy had prevented the deaths of many innocent people. That was why Mr. Dean wanted to meet with the guys, but they had already fled when he got to them. Zanhev laughed loudly after a few seconds, which caught the Lord's attention. The guy began to think over everything Dean had just told him and put it all together. Zan was proud and insanely happy that his hesitation on the field was not a blunder, but actually saved people's lives and was even noticed. Of course, Mr. Dean didn't know what Zan was thinking and looked at him very strangely. He quickly realized with a caustic smile that this guy was not as simple as he seemed. The city king turned to the guy to clarify if he still wanted to go up to the tower, which brought Zan out of his musings. Dean wasn't going to be left without any information, so he clarified exactly why he needed to provide it. The Lord asked him to tell him the reason for this sudden desire. Quite a few people wanted to get into the tower, but Dean was interested in this particular man's purpose. Zan hesitated and mumbled, wondering whether to tell the Lord the truth. He realized that he had nothing more to lose, and answered honestly that he wanted to take the first place in the ranking among the players. Mr. Dean didn't expect such an answer from the seemingly quiet boy, and was even more surprised when he seriously said that he wanted to break Nagi. Both boys simultaneously remembered Nagi's player with all her mighty power, and Dean thought he had gotten the answer to his question. A sepulchral silence hung in the master's room, and the guys looked at each other silently. Zanhev pondered what he might get for such an answer, whether Dean would approve of it or punish him. The Lord interrupted the boy's thoughts by calling his name loudly, and he responded immediately. Dean asked Zane if he wanted to see what was outside his window. The guy was a little confused by the strange question and didn't dare to answer for a while. Zan didn't say anything and silently walked to the Lord's window, looking carefully at all the buildings in the Sky Tower terrarium, which was visible from here. Dean asked the lad if he could see something like a fence made of sharp and sturdy sky blue steel in front of the tall buildings. The Lord explained to Zan that everything outside that fence belonged to the Avalon Guild. As it turned out, this guild was under Nagi's leadership, and Dean quietly said that it all had a gorgeous view. Zan looked around the buildings with bated breath and in wild shock once more and thought about how powerful it was to have this all in his power. At that very second, the dazed guy realized how ridiculous his statement about the Naga player sounded. He thought of his rival and looked up at the tower. Then his own words about how he would break her came to mind. Zan immediately realized that it wasn't Nagi herself who was to be broken, but much deeper and bigger. He envisioned a bunch of people connected to her and her power, specifically people who would have to be overthrown before she realized anything. The weary lad was alarmed at the outcome he had just come to. He was now defying all of these people at once. Clenching his hands tighter into fists, Zan began to think about whether he could handle such a difficult task. He remembered himself at school, where he couldn't do anything even in his small class. His musings were abruptly interrupted by Mr. Dean, who suddenly placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that he would need reliable backup. Dean seemed insanely happy about the new venture and ally, unlike Zan, who was still incomprehensible. The Lord had announced in all seriousness that he would help the boy climb to the top of the Tower of Heaven. Zan couldn't believe his ears and asked several times if he understood him correctly, to which Dean nodded his head several times and expressed his sympathy for his goals and objectives. Dean added that it was in his best interest too, since their goals were somewhat similar. The Lord hugged Zane tightly around the neck in a brotherly manner, not even giving the guy a chance to breathe correctly, and began to ponder aloud where they should start the operation from. Just then, he bounced sharply and broke into a grin, shouting that he remembered something. The Lord addressed the guy by name, saying they had missed an important point. Seeing Zane's incomprehension, Dean clarified whether the guy had already registered as a player candidate. After discussing all the details with Dean, the guy exhaled heavily and walked out the door of the room, thinking about how tired he was and glad he was finally out of there. Zan was happy with one thing. He knew how to get up into the tower and was loud about it. Behind Zan's back, who had completely forgotten about him, stood a stern Mr. Ran, who sternly asked if he really hoped he could do it. The guy immediately remembered that Ran had been standing and waiting for him at the door all this time. The Lord didn't miss the opportunity to speak up and said he had warned him, as he didn't have the necessary strength to climb the tower. He added that he threw bold promises left and right instead of heeding his words. After a brief pause, Mr. Ran asked Zan if he was confident that he could defeat a player like Nagi. Hearing no denial or apology, Ran began to insult the guy, warning him not to be so cocky and stupid. The master started to raise his hand, to show Zan his level of fighting again if he desired. Suddenly, an embittered Excalibur flies between Ran and Zan with lightning, throwing the Lord's arm back. She stopped at the staircase railing and said menacingly that she was sorry for her blunder. Kaylee instantly became frantic and started yelling at the insolent Ran, saying she wasn't interested in his status or his lousy words, and that he had no right to tell them what to do. The girl said that he would regret all his words because they would soon become much stronger than his, and she would make him apologize. Zan Hev joined the hostile conversation at the exact moment, agreeing with his partner. The guy started shouting loudly that they would become strong and climb the tower. With a slight hesitation, he finished his speech by adding that they would eventually defeat the Nagi. Zan Hev kept his crazy eyes on the vile Mr. Ran to show him he was wrong about them. Ran only calmly said that they completely misunderstood his words, and he had no idea why Mr. Din liked them so much. He had no choice but to agree with everything he had just heard, but as he left, he said he would keep a close eye on them. Mr. Ran also wondered how long they would last and where their insolence would ultimately lead them. Having made his point, Ran fairly walked away, leaving Zan and his partner alone in the corridor. Zane and his partner were alone in the corridor, staring at the departing Ran silently and angrily. As soon as the gentleman disappeared from their sight, the guy immediately fell to the floor, exhaling loudly and rejoicing that he had finally left, to which Kaylee asked him to get up now. The girl was fired up about their new goal, and wanted to get strong soon so she could paint the beautiful face of this vile and arrogant type. Still lying on the floor, Zan eyed Kaylee warily and didn't dare to cross her, quietly agreeing with her. The guy decided to still tell her what Dean had told him, and beckoned his partner to the nearest window. He pointed her to the tower and everything behind the hedge and told her that was the place they needed, but Kaylee already knew that because it was obvious to her. Zan was recalling in detail the place Mr. Dean had mentioned for further down the list of players. Meanwhile, somewhere at the gates of the central sky tower terrarium, a girl surrounded by many different creatures stood at the gates to announce the first obstacle. She waited for everyone to gather, and when she noticed a sufficient number of willing players, she greeted everyone. All present greeted the girl in return, and she solemnly announced the beginning of selecting candidates for the players. The partners watched the buildings and the tower from afar, trying to find the right path. Zan annoyedly told Kaylee that they were doing badly since they couldn't even find the location of the exam. The girl angrily asked the guy how he would get to the tower if he couldn't even find the exam location, but Zan thought it would be easy. The guy quickly remembered Dean telling him that they should just let them follow the people if they couldn't find their way for a long time. Still, Kaylee didn't understand who the people were they were talking about. Zan recalled something they should immediately realize as soon as they saw them, but began to question whether this could be another test. At the same time, the girl heard footsteps behind her and words of permission to destroy someone there. Kaylee started to listen and noticed an embittered guy walking forward, answering someone who said it wasn't time yet. The girl saw the guy walking by and talking as if to himself, and thought he looked like a psycho. At the exact moment, Excalibur stopped gazing at the strangers and silently began to look at them. A moment later, she asked Zan if these were the kind of people he had in mind when he spoke of the details of their journey. Zan Hev didn't immediately realize what he was talking about. Still, when he too noticed what his partner was seeing, he fell silent. Somewhere in the corner of the street, a bunch of guys were sitting around discussing the energy of the God-sharpened sword and the upcoming election. More people were walking by, discussing being focused and working hard to get on the list. One of them begged someone named Zandarkan to be a little longer patient for the realization of his plan. The partners observed a pattern of strange types going in the same direction, most likely the right one for them. Kaylee hesitated and offered to give up and go home, but Zan told her to pull herself together and put aside doubts. Suddenly, someone's heavy hand fell on the daredevil's shoulder, pushing him away. Zan looked back and saw a stranger in a plague doctor's costume in front of him, or perhaps it wasn't a man at all. This unknown man, along with the rest of his kind, asked Zan to get out of the way. The man quickly apologized, stepped aside, and excused the strange company forward. Escalibra had already prepared her fists and asked her partner if she should deal with him for this, but Zan immediately calmed her down and stopped her. Just like that, the partners didn't notice themselves finding the place where the player's Obro exam is being held. Kaylee said it looked pretty quiet, and she'd blow half the place apart if they looked like that guy with the beak. And for once, Zan cheerfully agreed with her. The guy noticed those plague doctors amongst everyone again, and thought it was strange that even these weirdos wanted to get into the players and were standing in the selection of candidates. Escalibra noticed someone coming up on stage, and Zan figured they were about to explain the conditions of the exam. A girl named Momo, who was the examiner and part-time player, announced to everyone that most were already in. The partners listened as Momo asked permission to start the selection and discussed the exam to select the C players. Zan recalled a conversation with Dean, who told him about the criteria for selecting players, and added that there was nothing special about it. The gentleman clarified that one simply had to show one's specialness, thereby attracting the examiner's attention. Dean was sure that it would be a cakewalk for someone who could tear down walls with one punch, and asked him not to worry. The master reassured and encouraged Zan, telling him that there was nothing to worry about and he could walk around and watch. While Zan was reminiscing, Momo was already in the midst of the selection process and managed to turn someone down, informing him that he had been knocked out. The girl passed by many candidates and said one word to all of them one after another: "You're out." Zan hadn't even imagined or thought there would be such a tense atmosphere here, while Kaylee wasn't surprised and said that it was a common thing. The guy pondered that if she were a player like Dean and Ran, she was bound to have some criteria for selecting players. Zan began to quickly think about what those criteria should be so that he wouldn't drop out before realizing anything. Meanwhile, Momo walked up to one simply huge guy and sternly told him that if he kept making the examiner look down on him like that, it would all end right now. The guy didn't quite understand her well, or maybe he just didn't hear her. The girl yelled at him to bend over, and he started sighing heavily. He started oohing and eyeing and eventually apologized. Still, Momo wouldn't let it go and asked if he wanted to fight her. The flustered guy started to refuse and crumple, but the two seemed to be onto something and said she understood him. Momo got everyone's attention behind the huge guy with a loud announcement. When they were ready to listen to her, she briefly announced that they had all been eliminated and heard multiple outrages instantly. The angry candidates took turns shouting various appeals and requests to Momo, pressing pity on her, or simply threatening her. The girl was already backing away when she heard someone's voice, who said he agreed with the outrage and wanted to know by what standards she selects players. Momo suddenly did a sharp acrobatic stunt, raising dust all around, and said she certainly had standards. At this time, Mr. Dean was having a snack and choked up from the sudden explosion. Mr. Rand rushed to help his boss up and asked what was wrong with him, hearing back that he had died and been resurrected at the same time. Dean stood up and cheerfully said that it looked like the explosion was just at the exam location. Momo didn't just perform an acrobatic stunt. She summoned a giant monster to her aid, saying that everything was going in the wrong place again. The girl was a player from the Golem Trainer class and said that since they were so eager to know the criteria, she would say at once. Momo went on to say that the player examiner could determine the level of player candidates. Some of the guys were outraged by this information because she could make up anything she wanted on the fly. The girl heard some unflattering remarks about her and suggested that everyone come to her and discuss the issue. Momo added that those who didn't want to do so, let them leave right away, and the rest of us would get back in line. The player candidates quickly divided into those who left and those who quickly took their place in the row. The girl sighed unhappily and said that it was always like this, forever. They all needed to see the difference in levels with their own eyes. Momo suddenly interrupted her speech when she heard someone shouting loudly that she was a slacker and sitting there just smiling. Concerned, Zan was already trying to calm down an infuriated Kaylee, who was yelling that she was trying to keep quiet. Still, her whole selection was starting to piss her off terribly, and she didn't even consider them for candidates. The guy was worried that there was going to be trouble from his partner now and tried his best to shut her up, but she got even more pissed off. Kaylee also said that if the selection of the players they were so eager to become was treated in a detailed manner, she never once fell for it all. The girl couldn't calm down and asked her partner what he thought. Zanhev had already frozen from surprise and fright because he noticed something behind Kaylee's back. The girl turned around and saw Momo standing in front of her, asking if she would like to be taught a lesson. Momo asked them to approach her and specified that if they could touch even the ends of her hair, she would give them credit for the exam. Escalibra lit up at such an intriguing offer and gladly accepted, asking if she would keep her promise. Momo walked the shortest distance possible to Escalibra and glanced menacingly at her. An in-world announcement announced the challenge to Zanhev and Escalibra by Momo. The other candidates watching all this laughed and shouted that they were stupid for daring to do such a thing. Some candidates just watched silently and drew conclusions in their heads. This whole situation affected the other candidates either way, positively or negatively. Momo started to ask Kaylee if she would attack her or if they should stand like this all night, to which her opponent told Momo to attack herself if she wasn't afraid. Momo couldn't believe her ears and questioned if the girl was sure of her decision and wanted to die right now. Callie responded by calling her arrogant and insolent. Zanhev tried to intervene and calm both girls, wanting to settle things peacefully. While the guy talked about his peaceful intentions, something behind him seemed to explode with a deafening rumble, scaring Zan badly. The other candidates anxiously started looking around for the explosion's source. Meanwhile, while they were all talking amongst themselves, the golem simply fell to the ground with a resounding thud, just as everyone present thought. Someone next to the golem said they had failed miserably if they wanted to eliminate it, and it had unraveled their praised player evaluators. Sitting on the fallen golem was a guy Kaylee had seen earlier and thought was weird. He was because he stated that their criteria were terribly boring. The guy addressed the examiner and said that he would eliminate whoever needed to be eliminated on his own. Both girls simultaneously thought that there was definitely something wrong with this crazy guy. The guy appealed to some Xandarkin again, asking him to destroy them all. Momo addressed the guy directly, saying menacingly that he was pathetic for thinking about the unfairness of his exclusion from the players. She added that all she had to do was show her abilities to any of the candidates, but since that was the case, now it was time for her to get down to business. Suddenly, Zanhev ran past the girls, surprising them both. He asked his partner to help. Otherwise, many others would get hurt. Escalibra didn't want to leave Momo unanswered, but agreed to help Zan and told her rival she was lucky today. The girl ran to her partner and asked him to give up her seat to go about her business. Zane, who was running, was suddenly stopped by a strange man in a hoodie. The man asked Zane to move over, saying he had already done enough damage. The stranger got ahead of the guy and yelled to wish him luck, while Zan tried to catch up and stop him. The hooded guy walked straight towards the angry monster flying at him. The stranger was utterly calm and seemed to be doing his usual thing. The crazy guy, determined to destroy everyone, commanded his beast to run at everyone to attack. The red-headed beast quickly accepted the boss's order and moved further towards the enemies. There was a blinding flash at that moment as the monster was already flying towards the hooded guy. A second after the flash, the surroundings became indistinguishable, and all the candidates saw the monster shatter into small pieces from the powerful impact. The hooded candidate named Pastas continued to chew gum like nothing had happened and said it was the easiest thing to do. Kaylee was furious as she was just warming up for the coming battle, and Zan was thrilled with the power he saw and was trying to figure out his ruse. Momo turned sternly towards the guy who had made this whole mess at the screening. The guy was cursing loudly at himself and his dead beast for their misfortune, and couldn't believe it had happened. Pastas asked the rebel if he had done enough damage or needed to add more, which caused the guy to react angrily. The rioter asked who he was, and a certain pink-haired girl replied that the guy was as much a candidate as he was. The pink-haired girl walked closer to the guy and asked him not to be so stubborn and just leave, to which the guy yelled at her not to order him around and shut his mouth. The girl was surprised at such a menacing tone and said that it wasn't an order but advice. After all, he makes his own choices. She advised him to look to the sides, where other indignant candidates were already standing, ready to brutally fight him. The rebel slowly looked around at the angry guys standing there and quickly realized that he would not be of any use. He yelled at the top of his voice that he would show them he was worthless. It seemed as if he would never shut up with his threats and curses, but the situation was saved in time by the guards who took him to prison. The candidate stood and listened to the inadequate man's cries for a while before he was removed from the selection and discussed his strange behavior. Kaylee said the guy was nothing, but Zan was glad they avoided the examiner's attention. Suddenly, someone behind Zan's back raised his hand and asked for permission to ask a question, which attracted the guy's attention. The same plague doctor asked Momo what they should do now. Should they get back in line and take unwarranted exceptions, or would there be more assignments? Zan Hev was even a little scared that this strange type had reappeared from behind and just as stealthily. The candidates slowly started to resent waiting in line again, but they wouldn't back down. Some didn't seem to understand anything, especially how to get a pass. Conversations continued between the guys that row B had just passed because he had enough money. They still stood, and some passed even by the most ridiculous criteria. Listening to all this, Zanhev realized that the situation was heating up, and if it continued like this, nothing good would come of it. Also, the examiner had disappeared somewhere, so badly timed. After hearing all the talk about the selection and herself, Momo said they obviously had something to say, judging by their conversations. In front of all the candidates on that very giant golem stood Momo. The partners were surprised and angry at the same time that the stone monster had survived after all, and the girl herself had gotten close to them stealthily. Some candidates were furious when they saw her and shouted that she no longer dared to do whatever she wanted. They would no longer tolerate such treatment. Momo seemed amused by all this, standing on the golem and smiling broadly. The girl stood majestically and there was complete silence for a while. Zan saw the still disgruntled faces of the candidates and began to fear for their actions, but Kaylee asked him to stay close and not move away. The candidates were determined and clearly had no intention of backing down. She lined up a new row on her own and waited to see what Momo said about it. Time passed, and no one present still intended to leave the selection. Momo's expression suggested she was very pleased with the picture she had before her. After a little more silence, the girl hurriedly reassured everyone, asking them not to worry so much because they had all passed the selection. The candidates immediately changed their faces and sincerely did not understand what happened. Momo explained that the primary criterion for selection was resistance, standing one's ground no matter what, a player's main quality. Golem added that players weren't worthy of being players if they followed other people's rules. Hence, resistance was the first criterion for selecting candidates. Momo looked at everyone and asked if anyone had any questions. Still, it was evident that everyone agreed with her decision, no matter what she was saying now. Only the pink-haired girl out of all the candidates didn't mind asking Momo a question. She could not understand how they all passed if there were so many of them. Momo heard the girl and immediately agreed with her, saying that she was right. She added that the number of those who had passed was much higher than she had realized, but the reason was quite simple. Looking at Kaylee and Zane, Momo clarified that some bickered the most among them. In view of such circumstances, the girl had one condition for them, which she fulfilled, and she promised them a personal letter of apology. Momo asked for the names of the most insolent candidates, and they took turns calling out their names loudly. The girl looked approvingly at both of them and seemed to be thinking of a further action plan. Momo asked her partners to surprise her with at least one of their abilities. She specified that they would all be in for a surprise if they met her expectations. Momo immediately revealed her cards and said that the surprise would be the acceptance of everyone present into the players. Unlike the cheerful Kali, the focused Zan took this as a challenge of maximum responsibility. The guy turned to his partner, fully ready to ask if she was ready. Escalibra, without a second's thought, quickly and with genuine excitement replied that she had been ready for quite some time. In the exact second, a bright blue light lit up in front of everyone. Some candidates were even a little scared, hoping these lightning bolts would not harm their lives. The pink-haired girl and the hooded guy were also surprised by the strength of their partners. They began to guess that, for all its power and strength, it was very similar to a weapon with a soul, which they called personality. Zan Hev, having merged so powerfully with the Excalibur into one, was already hovering in the air a second later, confused, not knowing what to do next. All the candidates waited in anticipation for a further show of force. Momo, noticing things were not going any further, grimaced and said she was giving them exactly 5 seconds. Kaylee and Zane began to bicker, blaming each other for their inability to show their majestic strength to everyone right now. Momo started counting down, finally pissing off Kaylee, who knew it could take Zane much longer to gather her thoughts. Kaylee started furiously yelling for her partner to come up with something already, maybe an unexpected trick, and Zan asked her to be quiet. The guy worriedly thought that he didn't have any trick in store and was relying on Kaylee, but now he didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a thought popped into his head, and he asked his partner to wait a little longer. Kaylee heard Momo's countdown and said she was ready to go herself and figure something out on the spot. The partners had already heard the countdown ending, and Zan told Kaylee to rely on him. The report was finished, and Escalibra seemed to emerge from the sword and look at the guy hopefully. Zan cheerfully thought he had completely forgotten one thing. Overwhelmed by the crazy string of events, he decided to show his reality. Zan stepped forward to Momo and held out his trump card for her to see, saying that this was his specialty. Momo questioned the guy about his specialty, but it wasn't clear from her face if he pleased her. The guy showed Momo his cell phone, confirming his answer. The candidate stared at the guy's device with surprise and in mild shock. Even those who didn't seem interested were attracted to Zan's feature. Escalibra wasn't surprised at all, and on the contrary, he was upset that he had traded their power for some obscure device. Zanhev, noticing the many interested looks on his face, began to explain what this device could do. Suddenly, Kaylee was furious at Zan, saying he had asked her to trust him, but he couldn't even explain what this was, which was useless. The girl started shaking the poor guy with all her might, yelling that if she had known what he was going to pull, she would never have gone for it, because now no one would take them in. Kaylee continued to rage at the guy and insult him when Momo smiled and informed them that they were accepted. Escalibra stopped choking and coddling Zane, stopping and shifting her gaze to Momo. The guy started to ask if they were accepted and why she hadn't even finished listening to his explanation of what he was holding. Momo was very surprised and asked why she needed any explanation when she could see everything perfectly herself. Zan was surprised and shouted, asking how she knew about the smartphone. Momo clarified if she remembered their names correctly, and jumping off the golem, said that she would never have thought to see the thing in person. The girl said she would keep her promise in gratitude, but Zane wasn't interested in that anymore. He wanted to know how she knew about smartphones. While the guy was shouting and demanding an answer, Momo turned to all the candidates. The girl loudly announced that on behalf of the player Momo, all the candidates present here were accepted. Zan didn't want to settle down and tried to make his way through the crowd with one goal: finding out where she had heard about the phone. The girl said that if he had any questions, he should look for answers on his own. Momo would not answer his question and only informed him they would see each other at the final exam. The girl returned to her room, announcing to everyone that she had passed the selection and leaving a curious Zan there, guessing. Meanwhile, the partners had made their way back to Mr. Dean's domain. Dean listened to Zane's story about smartphones and stared at him in bewilderment, unsure what he was talking about. He reminded the guy that, as he already knew, he had recently dropped out of the competition and knew little about the new things in the world. The Lord clarified that if there was anything else he wished to share, he would ask him, but Zan politely declined. When he left Dean's room, he thought about how much he had helped them with everything, and it was awkward to ask him for anything. Zan couldn't shake the thought that if Momo had heard about smartphones, then maybe there was or is someone else here besides him. It was a shame that he was scared every time he remembered reality, even though he had promised himself he would be different. Zan walked down the hallway and mentally berated himself for such ridiculous thoughts. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that when he passed the stairs, he passed a mysterious man with his face covered. The stranger took advantage of the situation and quickly jumped through the open window. The boy jumped over the high fence and dashed away through the alleys. Mr. Dean was sitting on the windowsill in his room and cheerfully told Rand that it looked like they had taken a bite. He asked Rand to find out as much as he could about smartphones, and he nodded obediently. Meanwhile, in the alley, an unknown guy told someone that that puppy had actually messed with Dean. He said it made it hard for him to get out of there undetected, but he succeeded because of his high class. In a dark alley, the Plague Doctor gang stood in the alley and thanked the guy for a job well done. The guy reminded the head of the gang of their arrangement and said he remembered everything and would pay him half if he got the correct item. Looking into the man's incredulous eyes, the chief of the Plague Doctors said he had promised him he would fulfill his part of the deal. The guy agreed and asked him to trust, not worry, and wait for him to fulfill his part of the bargain. Suddenly, the guy abruptly turned around and froze, already suspecting what had happened. A mighty hand flew into the mysterious guy with a closed face, piercing through him. The guy released one last curse and said this was what he expected, as the Plague Doctor pulled his hand out of his dead body. Having done their job, the gang of Plague Doctors was moving away from the alley, leaving him here. The chief said the smartphone's location was still unknown, and someone urgently needed to get it to him. He also set a condition that everyone who met them on their way should not be spared. By pity, the chief meant to destroy them immediately, even if it was someone like Zane Hev. The gang watched the windows of Mr. Dean's building from the alley for some time longer. One reported that Dean was still nowhere to be seen, and their path was clear. The head of the gang reported that now was as good a time as any for them. After the silence, he informed everyone they would move out soon. Mr. Dean called Zainhev back for another conversation, maybe not just him. Dean handed the guy some paper, and he studied it carefully. The sheet did not explain or clarify anything. It just showed a figure of 6 million, and Zan asked what that meant. The gentleman calmly replied that it was his and Kaylee's account, which surprised Zan and shocked him. Dean explained that it was a bill for injuring the city guards, repairing the prison walls, and other minor expenses, not counting food and lodging, which he'd kindly decided to exempt them from. Zan inquired of Dean about the whereabouts of the jewels they had on them during their imprisonment, and learned that their red-hooded masters had found them the same day. The master informed the lad that if they would work for him for 2 or 3 months, the debt would be completely closed. Zan was mortified by such news and thought he hadn't gotten one step closer to Nagi yet. Dean was still going to find out about the smartphone. The Lord snapped the guy out of his anxious musings and told him he had one more way. Dean added that this way implied that he would pay off the entire debt within only 1 week, which interested Zane very much. The lad genuinely excitedly informed the gentleman that he would do anything to pay it off sooner. The village streets around the tower were filled with children running around with a ball. Zainhev and Escalibra, accompanied by Mr. Ran, walked along the village's streets. The boy grimaced as he thought about how he never thought he'd ever have to drag Ran around, and how awkward it would be. Kaylee couldn't take it anymore and quietly wondered to her partner how long they would have to follow this upstart, but he didn't know. The girl was angry at the guy for not elaborating on that point, but Zan said he hadn't even had time to ask since it had all happened too suddenly. The guy also reminded her they were here mostly because she couldn't hold her own at the main gate, so now they would have to be patient. Mr. Ran walked ahead of his partners and listened to their pointless bickering. He was tired of listening to their arguments and reminded them to follow him silently. Zan quickly agreed and covered his mouth with his hand over his and Callie's mouth, who was still trying to break free and say something. Ran heard his partner's nasty mooing and thought he would never understand why Mr. Dean tolerated them. He remembered a recent conversation with his boss when he was about to send his partners out on patrol, much to Rand's surprise, and asked him to calm down, as he had his reasons. Dean also added that he would like to keep an eye on them, but he would be out of town for a while. Mr. Rand had already guessed what the boss meant by "won't be in town," and asked, hopefully, if he had understood correctly. Dean nodded approvingly and, exposing his missing limb, said his left arm was ready. Once again, he politely asked Rand to keep an eye on his partners while he went to the 15th floor to get his arm, after which he could take care of them himself. Mr. Rand thought the further he walked, the more he felt he did not share his boss's views about the two men. He could hear the boy's silly and ridiculous swearing behind his back and tried to understand why Mr. Ding was so worried about them. Mr. Rand was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice that he had crashed into something. It turned out that he hadn't hit something, but someone. Some boy was already lying on the ground from the collision with him. The boy was distraught when he saw that his hot dog had fallen out of his hands and was lying beside him. A second later, the boy shifted his gaze higher and looked to see who had caused his fall. His partners had noticed the situation and were already talking about how the kid was in trouble, since the sauce from his hot dog was already on Zan's clothes. Zan was sure things were bad, because Mr. Rand's temper was too fiery, and he wouldn't let it go. Mr. Rand stared at the boy momentarily, and then simply walked forward silently. The partners were quite surprised by Rand's behavior, which was not like him at all, even strangely. Zan's friends began to run up to the boy, and Zan decided to ask him how he was doing. Kaylee was sure that he was fine because Rand hadn't touched him. Instead of defending their friend, the boys started yelling angrily at the boy, asking how he dared to hurt Mr. Rand. The girl started cursing at the boy for not watching his step, but Zan decided to intercede and said it would be a good idea to ask him how he was feeling. The boys heard Zan's words, turned around, and said that it was none of his business at all, and since the boy was alive, it was no big deal. And Kaylee walked over to the girl, called Rand a fool, and said she was very surprised that even the children were protecting him here, which made the little rebel very angry. They got into a heated argument with insults and threats about Mr. Rana, and Kaylee couldn't stand it and asked what he was so good at. The girl did not back down and proudly stated that Rand always takes care of them and helps them. This statement confused the partners, as they could not imagine it. Zan and Kaylee quickly caught up with Mr. Rand, and the guy said that he was very popular with the kids. Rand didn't seem to understand what he meant and asked if he was making a mean joke, but Zan just nodded negatively. He added that he was completely relaxed about himself, but had to worry about his high popularity. Zan didn't immediately realize what he was talking about. Still, a second later, he understood, because he felt surrounded by a herd of small moccasins. The guy tried to free himself, but to no avail, and Mr. Rand laughed loudly, causing Kaylee to ask for help instead of laughing. As Zanhev sat all upside down surrounded by the little beasts, Rand said he should be proud. As he walked closer to the mochi, the Lord added that they were intelligent creatures from the heavenly terrarium who very rarely approached anyone on their own. Rand also said that these creatures are difficult to touch, even if you try to put your hand near one. The master was amazed when the little Mokiko let him pet himself. After thinking about something briefly, he said he had guessed just that. Rand explained that Mokiko's saving him last time wasn't an accident. Zan plucked up his courage and asked Rand if he could ask him some questions. Seeing that Rand didn't express any refusal, the boy gently asked if he had become a player to protect the city. The Lord, holding up his endless belt of cleavage, explained that he was nothing without that power, and he wanted to live up to the expectations of those who valued him. Rand raised his eyes to his partners and the children playing nearby. He repeated that he was doing this to fulfill expectations. Adopting a rather stern look, the Lord added that he became a player to punish evil on behalf of the weak. Zanhev stood confused amidst the mochi beside Mr. Rand. After a bit of silence, the guy said that, as expected, it was hard to understand him. Rand was already walking away and only replied that he didn't expect the guy to understand him. Kaylee cautiously approached her partner and gently asked why he looked so strange. He didn't even look like himself somehow. It was as if Zan didn't hear Escalibra and was completely immersed in his thoughts. The boy pondered that he didn't think they were weak, and Rand was probably thinking wrong. A moment later, a massive, bright explosion behind the hedge drew everyone's attention immediately. Zan began shouting in horror that a fire was about to start, and Kaylee remembered that it was at the side of the market where they were going. Mr. Rand looked on in horror at everything happening and seemed to begin to guess something. A gang of arsonists, plague doctors, stood menacingly at the beginning of the village square. The chief of their gang ordered everyone to go on the offensive and leave Zanhev to him. People were rushing madly through the streets trying to avoid explosions and attacks. Zan quickly asked a guy running by what was happening here, and the guy replied that some crazy guy was walking around the village setting things on fire. The guy wondered why someone would intentionally go around setting the streets on fire when there was a rank 2 player here defending the village. Zan quickly asked Rand where Mr. Dean was now and learned he was temporarily unavailable. The boy voiced his displeasure about that, and Rand said that they were the reason they picked a time when he wasn't available. Rand gave Zan his first mission, to alert the guards and bring them here immediately. Zan wondered what he would do then, but Rand thought it was a silly question. A second later, the Lord had already powerfully pushed himself off the ground in a high jump, bringing out his endless belt of cleavage. Zan began shouting after him that it was foolish to go alone, and Kaylee asked if he wanted to follow him in that case. The boy quickly wondered what he should do after all and decided to listen to Rand. He told Kaylee, who had no choice, to hurry up and call the guard sooner, saying he knew of a shortcut. At this time, Mr. Rand was already rushing towards the intruders at breakneck speed. As he flew, all he could think about was that because he was doing nonsense and thinking about the wrong things, all of this had happened. He remembered the guy jumping out of the window and decided that even then, he knew perfectly well that there was bound to be a problem. Rand didn't understand why he had not done anything and decided to himself that he had failed in his duties. As he flew forward quickly, he didn't immediately notice that something was in front of him and only paid attention when there was already an explosion. The powerful, blinding flash from the explosion thundered in different directions. Someone approached the gentleman and, calling him by name, asked if he was the head guardian of the village at the foot of the tower. The unknown guy informed Rand that he had shown up too late and was too late. The leader of the attacking gang and his subordinates were going to search for the man they needed. He decided to test if his strength was not so mighty against his opponent and struck the first blow. His subordinates immediately scattered to the sides of the gang leader. The ringleader directed even more fiery force energy towards Mr. Rand. He was desperately trying to set Rand's endless dissection belt on fire, but he was having no luck. The ringleader was busy with his business and missed the moment when the attack on his men happened. He looked around him and saw that Rand had taken down 2 of his subordinates with a single blow, who were already unconscious on the ground. The chief quickly realized that he had hoped for these guys' great strength and told Rand that he was worthy of his title of guardian. Mr. Rand didn't seem to listen to him and was only preoccupied with one mission, to punish the culprits. He quickly gathered all his strength into a fist and, using his cloth, formed a sharp spindle in the air. The leader used the power of flame and formed a massive fireball. The two rivals' forces met in the middle and destroyed each other. Mr. Rand was determined and wasn't going to retreat or give up. He ran straight at his opponent with all his speed, making a turn around him. A moment later, they were again staring at each other with embittered gazes. The leader didn't even have time to do anything before Rand flew towards him at breakneck speed. Mr. Rand slammed powerfully into his opponent and threw him whistling backwards, leaving a trail of sand and dust. With a quick jerk, he pushed off to return to his starting position. Landing precisely in his chosen spot, Rand gathered renewed strength for his next attack. He pushed off again powerfully and rushed towards the enemy with words of his impending demise. Suddenly, from nowhere, Mr. Rand was attacked from behind by the subordinates of the ringleader, grabbing him by his clothes. Mr. Rand did not hesitate to destroy all his attackers with one boa constrictor, although he lost half his suit. The ringleader, who had fallen into the stone wall without being able to get out, said that he had apparently lost. He clarified that he had no idea Mr. Rand could control anything other than his endless slashing belt. Rand wasn't going to listen to the ridiculous remarks against him. He simply asked him to name the target of their attack, as he would destroy him otherwise. The ringleader smirked and clarified that even if he did say something, there was no way he would let him live. The last thing the ringleader said was to address Guardian Rand that it was his defeat. Meanwhile, the head of the plague doctors informed someone that they had already completed their objective. Zanhev and Escalibra stood in front of him, not realizing what was going on or why familiar faces were there. The head questioned the guy if he was the same Zanhev, and as if to greet him in a friendly manner. The guy looked closely at the plague doctor and quickly realized he had seen him before in the exam. Escalibra hid behind her partner's back and quietly told him she felt bad. She added that these guys had already surrounded them on all sides, which certainly didn't bode well. Zan apologized to the gang leader and said that they had orders and were obligated to bring the guards as soon as possible. The guy quickly said they would love to chat next time because they were in a big hurry, but the gang leader interrupted them. The plague doctor explained there was no reason for them to meet next time because he had set the fires this time. Zan angrily asked the leader why he had done that, and he replied that he just wanted to talk privately and without witnesses. The plague doctor added that no one would be able to come up here, not Rand, Dean, or anyone else. Zan realized that there was no point in beating around the bush and bluntly asked what he needed from him. The head said that the guy quickly picked up on the gist of the conversation and liked it. He held out his hand to Zan and threateningly told him to give him the smartphone immediately, and then he would let him live. Meanwhile, work was simmering in the terrarium's sky castle on the 15th floor. Someone said that all the connections were working well and without unnecessary interruptions. A girl from the mechanics class named Marie Kienos was walking with a hot drink mug and saying things were not as bad as he had imagined. Across from the mechanic girl sat Mr. Dean, who agreed with her words. Some special device had been attached to where his left arm used to be, and Dean said he just wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. Marie clarified that she had already sped up as much as possible and was more interested in the village. Still, Dean didn't believe she was suddenly interested in life outside. The girl admitted that she didn't care, but she was worried that he'd pass out again, so she asked, to which Dean told her not to worry. He said he thought it was also a perfect time to ask something. Dean asked the girl if she had ever heard of a smartphone, which really piqued Marie's interest. The girl replied that even if he had heard of it, it was indeed a hot topic, but Dean only rushed her to answer. Marie said she had only heard rumors about him, like he could help awaken some special ability in you. The girl added that it would be best not to mess with the item while a terrified Zan stood before the head of the enemy gang. The boy looked around and around, noticing the plague doctor's men everywhere, and realized that they did it on purpose, as if to hint to him not to even think of running away. The gang leader once again asked Zane for his smartphone, and then he would let him live. The guy knew that the psycho who set the whole village on fire would never let him live once he handed him the smartphone. Zan wasn't exactly sure what to do next, so he stopped, slowly checking his pockets. A second later, the guy was already flying backwards quickly from the plague doctor's strong kick. The head warned Zan not to try to play with him, saying he wasn't stupid. As Kaylee rushed over to her coughing partner, the head clarified that he would punch to kill next time. Escalibra instantly erupted in a fit of rage like a match, pleasing the plague doctor, but Zan did his best to stop her. After the blow, the man was still trying to get to his feet. He told his partner that he was fine and that they would do as he asked them. Kaylee was still against it, but Zan wouldn't stop telling her he was fine. Looking into his partner's eyes, the guy seriously asked her to trust him again. Kaylee didn't bicker anymore and simply said she understood, helping him. Zan quickly thought that if he engaged in a fight, he would be fighting to the death, so he should avoid it until someone came to help. He decided not to lead him into unnecessary actions and simply pulled out his smartphone. Suddenly, someone interrupted their already tense conversation by asking what they were all doing here. A little girl approached the plague doctor and asked him if he had seen the fire, since he was talking incomprehensibly. Zan immediately recognized the girl who was so fiercely defending Mr. Rand. The gang leader asked the girl who she was and how she had gotten here. The girl replied that he must be a fool for not realizing the obvious, such as the fact that she had come here on her own feet. The plague doctor cursed loudly at his subordinates, who could not even block the road properly. The girl asked the head if he was hot in his tight mask. While the girl was still saying something, the plague doctor had already fired a charge at her. Zan immediately dashed towards her and quickly grabbed the girl, carrying her away from the blast. The plague doctor announced that the negotiations were over and would take the item he needed from the dead body. Zan carried the girl to a safer place and, calling loudly to Kaylee, told her to run forward. The boy threw the phone in the direction of the plague doctor and yelled to catch it. Escalibra gladly accepted the challenge and quickly dashed after the smartphone. The plague doctor wasn't prepared for this turn of events and loudly cursed. Kaylee is ahead of her opponent and quickly catches the phone in the air. The girl doesn't miss the opportunity to insult her crooked-faced foe by cheerfully asking him if he wants to take something away from her, running away from him to the front of the line. While Escalibra was running fast and shouting nonsense to the plague doctor, the enemy's subordinates were already waiting ahead of her. A gang of thugs simultaneously attacked the girl, grabbing her tightly and giving her no chance to escape. The little girl watched everything happening with fear and excitement and was visibly worried for Kaylee. The plague doctor ordered his men to break Escalibra's hands first so that she wouldn't be able to use the smartphone. The subordinates threw the girl to the ground and began to step on her hands, still clutching the phone tightly. The plague doctor turned to Zan, saying he was too pathetic and cowardly since he planned to abandon the girl and run away. The boy was utterly unaffected by these words, for he already had a further action plan. A scalding flame suddenly appeared under the feet of all the enemies present, forcing them to disperse. While Mr. Rand was finishing his business, he noticed a bright flash from afar that looked like a powerful explosion. Rand turned around in surprise at the sight and wondered in bewilderment if it could be Zainahev's power. The plague doctor was frightened and wondered if this was the smartphone power everyone talked about so much. He quickly looked at the phone, but he didn't see any change in it, and he was even more confused about where this guy got this kind of power. The plague doctor thought of the man's power, known as the light of the chosen one, and began to slowly back away. The little girl kept her eyes on Zan as she watched Zan master the player's mighty power. Zainahv was already standing there with a majestic sword in his hands. He said that with this, it would only take one swing to take him down or anyone else. The little girl curiously asked if he was a player like Mr. Rand, to which the guy asked her to move farther away, as it was dangerous here. Zainahv gathered his thoughts and seriously stated that he would end things here now. The plague doctor still wouldn't calm down and began persistently asking where he had obtained such a powerful force. Escalibra couldn't resist using his sword to comment on his silly questions. The partners simultaneously replied to the enemy player that it was none of his business and none of his concern. Zainahv rallied with Kaylee to deliver a decisive blow to the enemies, blinding everyone around them and leaving behind a huge fire trail. At this time, a pink-haired girl was standing somewhere and scrutinizing the area. Suddenly seeing a bright explosion, she exhaled a sigh of relief with the words, "Finally found it." Mr. Rand stood with the unknown fighters, and they all understood that what had happened would be the basis for great changes in the village's life. The unknown men came to the Lord and said that they had come with a warning. The unknown men were from the First Guild, and explained that from then on, the situation was under the control of the Avalon Guild. Rand said in a frenzy that this was utter nonsense because they were all standing by and watching while he was trying to handle the situation. The guild replied that such a statement was fundamentally wrong, as they had entrusted the whole matter to him as the guardian and trusted in his abilities. They also said that the fire had caused enormous damage, and it had affected more than just their village, which was why they had been sent here. One of them clarified that they had come on a mission, and at this point, he was the only one resisting everything. The guild wasn't going to get any more excited, so it simply reiterated that from now on, this matter belonged to the full control of the Avalon Guild. They clarified that it wasn't a suggestion, but a confirmation of further action. After the guy's powerful sword strike on the enemy, the plague doctor fell to his knees. The enemy, unconscious and without any movement, sat silently with his head down. Zan figured he had passed out, and this was the first time something had gone wrong since he had arrived. The lad quickly gathered himself as it was too early to relax and asked Kaylee how she was doing. The sword in the guy's hands was silent, as if it had never been animated with him. Zan looked worriedly at the sword and repeated his partner's name several times. The little girl decided to ask Zan if he was okay, and he told her not to worry. The boy became worried about why Kaylee wasn't answering him and decided that it might have something to do with her trauma that the plague doctor's men had managed to inflict on her. Zan thought he had relied on her every time he used his power, so now it was his turn to take care of her. The boy led the little girl behind him, telling her to get out of here as soon as possible. Zan was wholly immersed in his thoughts until he heard a strange sound. The plague doctor, who had come to his senses, was flying at him at breakneck speed. Zan had time to put his sword out as a defense and fight back firmly against the enemy. The plague doctor with the mangled face asked the guy threateningly how he dared to do such a thing to him, and he also said a lot of insults and threats. Zan thought only about how he had dodged the blow in time, or perhaps his opponent was inattentive, but in any case, he had to answer to it. The plague doctor's mask fell off his face, and he shouted at Zan to give him his sword immediately. Without waiting for a response, the distraught player rushed into another attack on Zan. The little girl had been there the whole time and watched in horror. She remembered the guy's words and took the opportunity to quickly run away. For some reason, the plague doctor would not let her go so easily and reached for her, asking her where she was going. The monster quickly switched from Zan to the girl and was about to catch up with her, while the guy yelled at her not to turn around. Zanhev threw another hard punch at the plague doctor, thus saving the girl and yelling at her to run even faster. The boy was pleased with himself this time, hitting the target accurately and preventing the enemy from grabbing the defenseless child. Zan saw that the plague doctor was still in pretty good shape and gave him a second powerful attack in a row. The boy was sure that this time it would work and knock the enemy opponent out of his strength. Zan was very surprised to once again see the resurrected plague doctor in front of him, who was still not backing down. The gang leader still asked Zan to give him the smartphone as he needed it. The plague doctor said things that didn't make much sense to the guy, like that he had to pay someone back. The only thing that interested Zane at that moment was that this psycho was like a zombie, rising back to his feet time after each attack. Suddenly, at the exact moment, Zane felt very bad. His legs and arms were not obeying, his head was dizzy, and there was a strong desire to vomit. The guy could no longer see his opponent well, thinking only about how much he was throwing up. Zan could no longer stand on his feet and fell to his knees, holding his sword tightly in his hands. He then instantly transformed back into his partner. A wave of regret and remorse came over the boy that it had happened again, even though he had tried so hard. He clutched Escalibra's hand tightly and apologized to her for being unable to handle it alone. He wasn't even able to move a finger right now. The only thing Zan didn't regret was seeing the little girl manage to escape and hoping she got out of there safely. The frustrated boy thought about the unfairness of Kaylee's relationship with him. Zan desperately wanted to protect her like she had protected him last time. The boy stood thinking over the sad situation, shedding bitter tears, and suddenly froze. Zan suddenly thought he saw Mokiko's fur in the pall of thick, dissipating smoke. He immediately thought it was inappropriate and was probably just imagining it or going crazy. Suddenly, Zan heard the voice of a pink-haired girl asking if he had given up so easily. Out of nowhere, a girl with a small Mokiko on her shoulder appeared in front of him and said that despite the situation, he could still smile. Zan seemed to be expecting anything right now, but not to see this girl, whom he recognized immediately. The pink-haired girl had a very memorable appearance and didn't stand on the sidelines during the exam. The plague doctor appealed to the girl that if she did not want to die, then let her leave, but she was clearly in no hurry. The girl offered to end the idle chatter and get down to business, for she had already seen his abilities. To put it mildly, she admitted that everything she saw was not very good, and to be more precise, it was not good at all. The girl suggested that the plague doctor give up all his worthless attempts to take away other people's things. With her suggestion, she further enraged her rival, who began to shout and threaten in a rage. The plague doctor lit up briefly and asked if she had come here for his power. He gave the rivals one last caustic look and promised to come back again. The plague doctor turned around and powerfully kicked the ground where he stood. A large explosion occurred next to him at the exact second, blowing a massive hole in the ground. The pink-haired girl realized that the plague doctor had an underground escape route, which was quite clever. She turned to Zanhev and told him that he should watch and learn such techniques, but all she saw were two bodies lying on the ground. The girl quickly realized that they were both unconscious and had passed out. The plague doctor had fallen through a hole in the ground into the city sewer. The infuriated ringleader was simply furious and yelled at the top of his voice for Zanhev to remember that his name was Mezcal. He promised to destroy this insolent fellow one day and take all his mighty power. After all his fiery speeches, Mezcal quickly strode down the underground passageways. Somewhere in the same sewers, leaning against one of the walls, stood a man from the headquarters of the Avalon First Guild. With his arms folded across his chest, he languidly spent time there, as if waiting for someone. The Avalonian even spent some time on his phone out of boredom. Long ago there was a time when one little boy had nothing. The boy even had to live on the streets and watch other kids' happy and carefree childhoods, envious that they had such trivial things as care and love. He envied such simple things that others took for granted. For this reason, all the horror and lawlessness he began to do began. The boy was simply taking this warmth and affection from other children, robbing their mothers of their lives right in front of their eyes. A second later, seeing the fresh blood on his hands, he was madly regretting what he had done. The boy always justified his actions by saying that he didn't wish anyone harm but just wanted to take a closer look. He stood and watched in silence as the children wept next to the bodies of the mothers who had passed away from them. For a while it seemed that these children's cries and screams did not stop for quite a long time, and were simply unbearable. From all this began the terrible journey of a bloodthirsty boy named Mezcal. He took everything from people to the end for survival and immediately repented for his actions, promising himself that it would be the last time. The boy grew up, and no matter how many years passed, he could never forget those eyes, the very first eyes. He was sure he was under some powerful curse that he would never be rid of, but also along with the torment of his conscience. In a moment of intense remorse and regret, a stranger approached the growing boy and told him that he was very sorry that God had forsaken him. The unknown man asked the boy to calm down and not cry, saying he was just like him and promising to provide Mezcal with everything he needed. He immediately turned to Mezcal with one request. He needed him to bring one crucial item. The two players moved towards each other in the middle of the sewers. Mezcal pulled a cell phone out of his pocket and began to scrutinize it, thinking that he could do it, after all, no matter how badly it hurt. He was pleased that he could finally repay that man. Mezcal sat in one corner of the sewers and examined an unknown object. Suddenly, a powerful fire projectile flew straight at him, exploding in his body. Someone was loudly telling him that it was a stupid decision to try to hide in the sewers. That someone was from the First Guild and added to Mezcal that it was the most suitable place for a rat like him. Mezcal started yelling that it was that person's item, and he should protect it at all costs. The guildman was surprised that the man could somehow resist his strong attack. He clarified that the nickname Cockroach suited him better than Rat. Mezcal noticed the look the guy was giving him and shouted not to look at him like that. This offended him for some reason, and he became enraged, lunging towards the guildman. The guy didn't like this behavior from Mezcal and offered to hold out against his magic. Directing all his strength at his opponent, the guy said he would let him go if he survived. There was a powerful explosion after which hardly anyone could stay alive. At that moment, the guy noticed something very familiar about his victim's place. Next to Mezcal's lifeless hand lay the very smartphone of Zanhev. A familiar face stood in front of the pink-haired girl and her partners. The pink-haired girl was an elemental class member of an unknown rank named Kina Lilith, who recognized the Avalon Guild member. Kina said she had already informed them of her refusal to accept their invitation to join their guild. The Avalonian was angry at such a brazen statement, but Kina's henchmen advised her to be careful of guild members. Following the one member, the rest of the Avalonians appeared along with Mr. Ran and asked Kina to retreat. As they talked about the village's safety, Ran figured they would say anything just to justify themselves. Kina was not going to retreat, for this was not defense, but leaving innocent people to die. The Avalonians didn't try to deny it, they just started talking nonsense. They said that the ones she was so protective of now were the cause of this mess in the village. The Avalonian suggested that Kina step aside if she wanted to prove her innocence. Rand didn't like what was happening right now, and he even thought it had something to do with his master. It didn't matter how Rand thought or what he thought, because in Dean's absence, he was the representative of the village. Ran realized that if he did it his way, he would break the agreement between the Avalonians and the village, and it would attack. He looked hopefully at Connie and realized she was his only chance to save these guys. Connie turned to the Avalon girl in a purposely ridiculous manner, and the girl was getting terribly angry with her. The girl was about to take a shot when someone interrupted her, ordering her to stop. In front of everyone stood that brave little girl. The Avalonians looked at the girl in bewilderment and began to ask who she was. One of the Avalonians asked the girl to look around them carefully. The Avalonians were standing on a rooftop, and all the open space around them was surrounded by someone. The leading guild member asked everyone present to name the organization they belonged to. The guys said there was no organization, but if they were interested, they would name themselves. They introduced themselves as players, candidates, and just friends of Zanahev. An in-world announcement said they were player candidates from Group C, who had recently been selected. The hooded guy reported that the guy they were hunting here had recently helped them all. He added that they couldn't pass it up if they realized what he meant. Kina thought this little girl had done a great job gathering everyone here. Kina's minion informed her to be careful as something was coming. Suddenly, in the exact second, a bright, powerful explosion was right before her. Beside Kina, a powerful stream of fiery light burst from the ground, making a huge hole. The player candidates quickly realized that the Avalonians would not give up so easily, calling out something to help. The Avalonians loudly commanded everyone to be ready immediately. Into the hand of each Avalonian from the fire stream came a particular roll of paper. The candidates realized this was how they delivered letters, which was impressive. The Avalon girl began to loudly inform everyone that it was an order from the captain. They read the text that they were to temporarily stop following the original plan. Everyone has heard that no one has ever touched someone with a smartphone. The main one from the guild informed the girl who disagreed that it was time for them to leave. She was terribly angry that it had turned out this way, but had no right to disobey. There was no way the player candidates expected the Avalonians to obey orders and leave so easily. Finally, one Avalonian asked them not to jump to conclusions and promised to meet. He added that their meeting would occur soon at the candidate's exam. Mr. Rand, paying no attention to anyone, was thinking about something seriously. He couldn't calmly digest the situation and clenched his fists tightly. Fires were being put out all around the village around the tower, and thick puffs of black smoke could be seen afterward. Mr. Dean, having finished his business, would return to the dilapidated village a week later. Dean had expected much, but not such a warm welcome from the settlement. The Lord tightly squeezed his new mechanical hand and wondered who had done this. It had been a little over 1 week since the fires had started. The villagers had all started working hard to quickly rebuild everything after the gruesome attack. Zanhev and his partner were recovering quickly at the local hospital. The guy didn't even think he could survive after everything and figured Kaylee was having that effect on him. Escalibur stared out the window without interest and silently agreed with everything Zan said. It seemed to Zan that Kaylee was still depressed about passing out with him then. On the other hand, he could understand her, because if he had been with his old master, this wouldn't have happened to her. Kaylee asked Zan not to think so much that it embarrassed him. The partners saw Pastis come to them on behalf of the entire group of candidates. He approached Zane and said that they were obligated to help him after he had gotten them all through the selection process. The boy remembered that fateful day and the psycho named Mescal who had attacked him. Zan didn't understand why he was going to destroy him, even though he was a candidate. He was just as curious about who attacked the village and who benefited from it. Pastis was also interested in it, but the strangest thing was that all the participants of the mayhem simply vaporized, leaving only their clothes behind. Ultimately, they knew only the attacker's leader, and Zan began speculating. Pastis snapped him out of his musings and hugged him and Kaylee tightly, telling him that their recovery was the most important thing now. They appeared to be the only ones risking their lives for everyone, but Kaylee was not pleased with this friendly attitude. Zan could hear Kaylee's indignation and Pastis's teasing, but his thoughts were entirely on something else. All he knew was that Nagi was there, but had no more information about the place. Zan asked Pastis if there were often fights in the tower. Pastis was surprised by this question and said he knew nothing about the tower. Zan asked him to tell him about what was happening there, but Pastis refused. The boy didn't understand why he didn't want to share what he already knew. Kali was wary when Pastis reminded him that they were still candidates. Pastis clarified that they were enemies in all things related to the game. That was why he didn't want to tell Zanu anything about the tower. Also, Pastis asked him not to take offense, and started to say that this is how life is, as he was hit by a door. Dozens of other candidates rushed into the chamber with visiting partners. They started shouting words of wishes at the same time, and Zan asked them to take turns speaking. Trampled by the candidates, Pastus remained lying on the floor and informed everyone that he was also a patient. He saw someone else's feet at the door and told them that Zan had another visitor. Zan yelled in shock, "Everyone get out immediately," because he would never recover if they initiated him in so many ways. Mr. Rand stood at the chamber entrance and interrogated Zan about what this was all about. The boy and the other candidates turned around in surprise at the Lord. Zan seemed most surprised and kept his eyes on him, asking why he was here. The player candidates looked at Ransan silently and were sure they would be punished for their past antics. About 3 hours ago, something happened at the outer wall of the village around the tower. Having arranged the dummies for practice, Lord Rand was deftly performing his usual tricks. He was furious and needed to expend energy somewhere, as he could not do anything at the critical moment. The most frustrating thing was that he had previously declared himself capable of anything. At this moment, Rand hated himself more than anything else, for he had failed to live up to expectations. He stood there and thought about the terrarium celestial tower and the players. Mr. Rand quickly realized that he hated everything about the tower from then on. He considered comparing the beautiful flowers that attracted insects so strongly to humans. Humans were also strongly attracted and drawn to anything related to the tower. Rand knew that there were a lot of people who wanted to enter the tower to fulfill their dreams. But after getting into the tower, they became just ordinary trash who always took something from others. Those others were usually weaker players, candidates, or just residents. Rand had always known that he and the city guards hated this trash. As a result, he stood in a chamber packed with unknown people who protected Zan. These unknown people were some of the people he hated, but were still his saviors. Zan was surprised when Mr. Rand knelt down and asked what was wrong with him. Rand realized he might have looked foolish, but thanked everyone present for saving the village. He sincerely respected this act as a keeper and a player. Connie entered the chamber next and apologized for being late. She had been unable to find the flower room for a long time. She got in just as Rand was kneeling in front of a crowd of people and was surprised, to say the least. None of the people present could explain to her what was going on here. Rand remembered Zan saying he couldn't understand him, except now he couldn't understand the guy himself. He realized that now all he had to do was accept him, or rather, not only him but all of them. Mr. Rand was a man of honor, and so it was the only way to pay him decently. Rand showed up to see Mr. Dean and apologized for his tardiness. Dean said it was okay, and he was about to check out his new arm. With the new mechanism, he made a huge and long hole and reported that he had overdone it a bit. Suddenly, Zan found his smartphone on his nightstand, surprised that it hadn't been stolen. Kina Lilith had put the phone there and reported that they couldn't find anything by the type of fingerprints on it. As it turned out, the phone was found in the sewers, and the girl decided she had paid off her boyfriend for the exam. Kaylee began to tell her partner that everything was very suspicious. At first, everyone wanted to kill each other for this smartphone, and now they had just dumped it and brought it here. Zan thought that maybe this wasn't the smartphone everyone was looking for, but he still didn't let go of the thought that someone else from his reality might be here. While looking at the phone, Zan suddenly started talking loudly about something impossible. Zan have right now, someone was calling his phone from an unknown number. The flustered guy clutched the phone tightly and didn't know what to do next. He remembered his promise to himself and decided to answer the stranger. Someone on the other end of the line was happy that the phone had been successfully placed in the right hands. Kaylee heard someone's voice on the phone say that throwing away such vital things wasn't a good idea. Since there was no response from Zane, the person on the phone asked if he was okay. All the guy could get out was some attempt to find out who was talking to him. The voice on the other end asked if he thought he was the only one here. The unknown person turned out to be Kim Taiwan, an Avalon Guild member of an unknown rank, who offered Zan a meeting. Zanhev thought the smartphone was the only thing connecting him to the real world. He hoped to find a person from his world here through the smartphone. When the guy came to the meeting, he did not expect that his smartphone would lead him to him. Of course, Zanhev immediately recognized his high school friend Kim Tae-wan as the player standing in front of him. Kim had been waiting for his buddy on the bridge, and he didn't think Zan would come to the meeting alone for some reason. Zanhev was genuinely surprised to see Kim and asked how he had gotten here. His school friend replied that he was the only one who had met the god Aso. Zanhev immediately realized that he wasn't fooling him and had probably been here for a long time. Kim Tae-wan looked friendly and slowly made his way towards his old buddy. He informed the still surprised Zan that they had a more urgent problem. Kim walked close to his buddy and touched his shoulder, asking about the phone. Zan Hev was even confused for a while, just like he had been earlier in school. The guy quickly pulled himself together and started yelling that it was a misunderstanding. Kim asked if he really had to clean up all his messes in this world. Zan Hev was still looking at Kim with surprise and even some fear. The guy didn't know what else he could say and quietly apologized to him. Kim Tae-won told his old buddy that he had remained exactly the same. He quickly removed his hand from Zan's shoulder and said it was all too pathetic. Kim clarified that it didn't matter if he was trying to imitate or impersonate him, because this sort of thing had happened before. He paused momentarily and asked Zan for something in return for such an act. Kim seriously asked his old buddy not to attend the player's exam. Zan Hev immediately said he was asking too much and wouldn't be able to do it. Kim Tae-won, who was used to winning, was surprised by this response and even stopped. Zan quickly gathered himself and seriously informed Kim that he would visit the tower. The guy clutched his cell phone tighter and said there was something else. Zan's smartphone was thrown right off the bridge a second later and was already floating in the water. Zan proudly informed his old buddy that he had never tried to parody him. Kim just grinned and asked him to calm down, because he wasn't the main character in the story. Zan replied that it didn't matter, since he would go to the tower anyway. Kim was about to leave and told the guy that he had changed. He said he would do his best to ensure he couldn't climb the tower. Zan noticed Kim's red glow and realized that he too had received the power of a god. At the exact moment, Mr. Ran jumped right on top of Kim from nowhere. He anxiously turned to Zan and said he had arrived just in time. Ran ordered the boy to return to the castle as his mate worried about him. Kim greeted Ran and said he was a character he used to like. Ran informed Kim that he had to answer to the law for using amplification against civilians. Kim arrogantly replied that he couldn't overpower him because he didn't have enough rank and strength. Ran quickly, thinking how easily the lad tore his mighty cloth. The Lord pointed another cloth towards Kim and asked him to stop his silly jokes. Ran didn't understand how this Avalonian dodged his attack so easily, but simply asked what he was up to. Kim noticed the alarm in his opponent's eyes and said he was surprised early on. Mr. Ran put all his efforts into wielding the canvas and ordered the lad to keep his wits about him. Kim only deftly dodged all the techniques and said he had learned all his manipulations long ago. Being one step away from Ran, Kim informed him that this skill was completely useless if the opponent could get so close to him. It seemed that Mr. Ran already had a plan for his next move and was about to implement it. He deftly grabbed a new cloth, throwing it at his opponent, and told Kim not to judge him by himself. Kim dodged again and replied that squeezing the cloth to increase speed wasn't a bad decision. A second later, he added that such an attack was still not enough. Mr. Ran was terribly angry at the arrogant guy and flew quickly in his direction. He swung and delivered his next strike to Kim through the canvas. At this time, Zan approached him and asked how he knew where they were, but Ran only quickly replied that it wasn't a good time, as they weren't done yet. Kim told the gentleman that owning a canvas to that extent was quite impressive. He tightened his grip on the phone and informed him that they were about to look at something else. The canvases glowed red, and Kim cheerfully asked if he was doing the right thing. Zan and Ran were enraged, and the former started yelling that it belonged to the master. Kim had already prepared to attack and asked the guy how he wanted to be beaten. At the exact moment, out of nowhere, Mr. Dean appeared in front of Kim and asked if he was a recruit. Kim immediately recognized Dean's second-ranked player and said that he was exactly the same as he was on Webtoon. Dean was already confident in his words, judging by how the guy ignored his question. Kim was a little worried about not noticing Dean immediately, and decided to be more careful with him. While Kim Tae-won was indulging in his thoughts, Dean was already at his back. Kim didn't wait any longer and used the power of the canvases with his reinforcement against the Lord. Dean deftly caught the cloth and asked if he had requested Ran's permission to use his skill. Kim said he hadn't seen a big problem with using his power for a while. Mr. Dean smiled evasively and said that someone definitely lacked good manners. Kim thought Dean was close to her and only dreamed of defeating him. Mr. Dean stood before the confused guy and slapped him on the forehead. He added that there was nothing he could do in this situation and would have to fix his upbringing with a beating. Dean threw the guy back with a slight movement of his hand, leaving a bright fire trail. Everyone heard a cracking sound, but Dean motioned for the guy to get up, as this was just the beginning. Kim rose and cheerfully said he was good on his feet even without warning. Ran asked the Lord not to move so far away, but he said it was fine. Dean turned on his rival and looked menacingly at him with some sort of plan. He approached Kim and suggested that he continue what they had previously started. Kim wasn't sure what Dean was saying. but he said that the village might be destroyed in that case. He figured he had no plans to stop this fight, but now he wouldn't lose sight of it. At that very second, Mr. Dean's entire body lit up with a bright red light, and Kim stared at him in horror. Dean came closer and closer to Kim and told him that he might as well go crazy for daring to say such things about his village. The frightened Kim realized at that moment that he couldn't even move. At that moment, other members of Avalon came to Kim's aid, and Ran immediately rushed to Din's defense. Mr. Dean said he would explain everything, but was in a terrible mood. The Avalonian, on the other hand, said that their team leader had heard him and suggested that he follow him to leave the area peacefully. Kim shouted at him not to embarrass him, as he had no intention of escaping from here. Suddenly, Kim heard something he did not want to hear. It was an order from the vice captain. The Avalonian explained to Dean that their new recruit was unfamiliar with the rules and agreements between them. Rand sternly asked him if he thought they would turn a blind eye to the matter so easily. The Avalonian informed him that they would pay any amount of money for the damage caused, as the vice captain had advertised. Kim Tae-wan realized how much trouble he was in and stood pathetically apart from everyone. Zan-Hev, who remained on the bridge, had also heard everything and was trying to digest it. Mr. Dean thought for a moment and looked around carefully at everyone present. Dean rudely told everyone to get out of here and added that Zan had two tiresome friends. The master turned to Zan-Hev, saying he had terrible taste in choosing people. Kim asked Dean goodbye if he had stopped regretting choosing unfortunate people like some, alluding to Zane. On that tense note, all the players peacefully went about their business. Dean didn't glance in Zan's direction, quickly walking past him. Zan-Hev was very tense and upset about the situation and regretted it. Above the castle village, around the tower, was pitch darkness and complete silence. Everyone living there had lain down to rest long ago, and no sound could be heard. Only somewhere in the distance, even more likely on the street, could someone's quiet whisper of regret be heard. At a time like this, only one person was working at the loom on a new cloth. While Ran was sewing a new endless dissection belt, he heard someone's heavy sighs. The Lord quickly gathered and went outside, seeing Ran with his head down. The guy didn't immediately realize how Ran was here with him so quickly. Ran began to tell Zan he was already strong and not to act thoughtlessly. Zan sadly replied that it wasn't he who was strong, it was Kaylee. He added that the fact that he hadn't hit him once proved it. The boy stood up and motioned for Mr. Rand to help him. Rand surprisingly asked Zan to attack him without too many questions. Zan immediately accelerated and moved towards the deftly dodging Lord. The guy turned around and ran to attack Ran again, but he once again recoiled and even managed to land a punch. Ran was hit pretty hard and he gritted his teeth from the pain. The boy ran to attack the Lord again and once again missed. This went on for some more time until Zan finally got tired and fell off his feet. Rand said it had already dawned and that should be enough, asking the lad to get up. He also added that using his body without a clear plan wouldn't make any difference. Zan said that he was utterly useless and was nothing without Kaylee. The boy dug his fingers into the sand in exasperation. He asked Rand if he should scrap this stupid idea of becoming a player. The Lord calmly asked Zan if he had come here by chance to complain. The boy was lying on the ground without strength and said his only wish was to become stronger. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice that insultingly ordered him to stop whining. Standing in front of Mr. Rand and Zan was Escalibra, who was clearly not in the best of moods. Her partner glared menacingly at the boy, and he only asked what she was doing here. Zan asked Kaylee how she knew he was there, but it was only dawn. The guy quickly wiped away his tears and noticed the girl's face, anxiously asking what was wrong with her. Escalibra could barely hold back a flood of tears, something no one had seen before. She cried and said that the real loser wasn't him, but her. Zan looked at his partner in bewilderment, and she asked him why he went to fight alone if he didn't think so. She was sure it was because she had broken her arm last time, and he had deemed her useless. Kaylee started to accuse him of lying to her, but Zan tried to calm her down, saying he didn't mean to hurt her. At this time, Mr. Rand stood nearby the whole time. He listened to the guy apologizing to a crying Kaylee and trying to restrain himself. Rand couldn't listen to this heartfelt scene of the partners anymore, imperceptibly emptying a stingy tear. He exhaled deeply and called out to both of them, saying that this was the first time he had seen such a sight. While they were both crying and ready to kill each other, Rand announced that he would be working with them. He noticed the surprise in their eyes and clarified that he would work with them to make them stronger. Dawn passed, and a bright morning came, in which the partners furiously thanked Rand. At one of the local coffee shops, the guy asked the others if they had heard the rumors about smartphones yet. The rumors suggested that the smartphone was being used by a man from Avalon, but the candidates were sure it was Zan. One of them said that's why the Avalon man met Zan, to find out why he was impersonating him. Guy added that it was only his theory and things could be completely different. Guy noticed as he met eyes with a girl he had been thinking about for a long time. He decided to seize the moment and said it was stupid to impersonate someone else. Guy was getting to the point that Zan probably wouldn't show up for the final exam, which is reasonable. Kina Lilith got tired of listening to this nonsense and stood up, letting everyone know she was leaving. The others turned to her in surprise, and she added that she didn't have time for idle chatter. The boy, so eager for attention from Miss Lilith, was left to fly in his dreams. The whole gang of candidates stood up following the girl and thanked the guy for lunch. Pastas quickly caught up with Kina and followed her, keeping a little distance. Suddenly, he asked if she liked Zan, taking her by surprise. It didn't take long for the girl to catch on, and quickly grabbed Pastis by the scruff of the neck, who was already yelling that it was a joke. She immediately let go of the guy, who began to quickly adjust his clothes. Kina explained that she didn't like people who jumped to conclusions. She also added that they didn't have time to sit around and gossip at all. Pastas quickly realized that the girl was right and immediately agreed with her. Mr. Rand stood with his partners on the cliff opposite the tower. Less than 10 days until the players' pre-testing began, and Rand hoped they were ready. He informed the boys that they would begin special training starting today. The partners looked up at the tall tower with delight and admiration. Rand had brought them here because it was the best view of the tower, and Zan asked why the training would be held here. Rand replied that they would find the answer once they had experienced it. He quickly turned to them and made a bright line with the cloth at their feet. The master asked them to try to step over that line. Kaylee clarified that if she understood correctly, they should just step over it. Zan stopped her and told her that if she was going to do it, she should only do it with him. The girl could no longer hear her partner as she stepped over the line, and it was as if she was paralyzed. Escalibra fell to the ground with a clatter, and Zan immediately rushed to her. Rand remained completely calm and motioned for Zan to tread next. The boy realized he had nothing more to lose and rushed forward. He felt something like an electric shock in his whole body. It felt as if his body had been split into several parts. Zan compared the sensation to when Nagi struck him in battle. The boy came to his senses as Mr. Rand approached him. Zan tried to stand up and wondered if this was the right place. Rand explained that they reached this place as soon as they crossed the line. He also said that this was the domain of the terrarium Sky Tower. Rand explained that it was an area under the tower's influence, though it was outside, and was called a dungeon. As it turned out, the master didn't bring them here just to get them used to the pressure of the tower in case they passed the exam. The main reason was the most essential characteristic of the terrarium. Rand said that the meaning of total annihilation didn't apply in the tower. He said they would pay a price in exchange for reaching the limits of the body's ability. The partners were surprised to hear they would have to pay some sort of price. Rand briefly clarified that they would lose a small portion of their memories. It didn't seem like such a big deal to the partners, and they decided it was nothing. The master said that everyone initially thinks that, but doesn't realize what they're losing. Rand added that it was better to experience something once than to explain it in cases like this. The partners watched in amazement as Rand walked to the cliff's edge and asked what was there. The guys carefully approached the precipice and peered into it, seeing many red eyes. Rand informed them that this was the forest of the vanquished, those who had ignored the full significance of the consequences. He could already see the fulfilled eyes of his partners, but he continued speaking. The master specified that they would be their opponents for the duration of the training. Unexpectedly, Rand pushed the boys off the cliff, telling them to try their best to survive. He also shouted that he had left them marks in the form of cloth inside the forest. The condition of surrendering the training was to find them and bring them back as soon as possible. Mr. Rand was alone, standing on the cliff watching the boys. He wanted to ensure they would develop and advance in these final days. If they couldn't pass this difficulty level, it would be best for them to give up. The partners fell in with the humans who never managed to become players. These monsters didn't look like players or humans anymore. Zan started yelling for Kaylee to get up soon or they wouldn't survive. He saw that she needed time, so he asked her to transform quickly. Kaylee started transforming, and Zan wanted to deal with the freaks immediately. The boy also remembered that they needed to find the hidden cloth for the Lord as soon as possible. Escalibra was already a sword, but not quite the sword everyone was used to seeing. Looking at them, Rand thought they had failed, but didn't give up hope. As Zan ran away from the maddened crowd, Rand thought that if they still hadn't realized their potential, he would not help them. Zan ran forward at breakneck speed, and all he could think about was why everything was going to hell. Escalibra was still exhausted from the fall and was not feeling well. Suddenly she woke up and thought she had dozed off for only a second. The girl quickly apologized to her partner and cheered him up. While Kaylee was unconscious, she had a strange vision. She didn't immediately realize where reality was and where she was now. One thing the girl knew for sure was that she was an Escalibra, which meant a legendary and divine sword. Kaylee sat and pondered on what her true purpose was. She pondered that perhaps it was just waiting here for something or someone. The girl was even frustrated by such sad thoughts. Escalibra sat alone on the mountain of weapons and looked somewhere in the distance. She missed God and wished he would start listening to her. Escalibra did not want to believe that the god had forgotten her. The girl sadly bowed her head over the instrument she was dutifully guarding. After a moment, she slapped herself sharply on her cheeks and decided not to think about it. Kaylee firmly decided that when she saw God again, she would be sure to ask him for it. She calmed down again and said she would always wait for God here. The girl looked sadly into the distance again and didn't worry if he was a little late. She knew this happened to her often and wasn't used to it. One thing the girl decided for sure was that next time she would ask him to give her his name. Kaylee didn't want to be called Escalibra anymore. She wanted something else. The girl wanted a name of her own that no one could forget. Kaylee was pulled out of her deep visions by Zane's loud call, begging her to wake up. She finally came to her senses, but didn't understand why she was the only one who had blacked out. Zanhev was standing in front of an army of sinister monsters, holding a stump of a sword. Kaylee quickly apologized to her partner, and he finally exhaled. The guy asked her to turn into Escalibra again, as he didn't want to give up. He also told her they would overcome everything if they did it together. In that exact second, a piece of sword turned into a legendary divine weapon in Zane's hands. Escalibra asked her partner if he was ready to give his best. The girl, dressed as a sword, lit up with a bright flame and said it was time to do it. Zan inwardly lit up with his partner and was ready to make history. Kaylee warned Zan to hold on tight, as they would get out of here faster than their enemies got bigger. The guy started to feel nauseous and said he would never get used to it. Zan was already exhausted and noticed something interesting as he looked at Kaylee. Though the girl's hair had grown back a bit, it was very noticeable. He remembered the god's glory. The legendary sword grows with its master, and finally realized what it meant. Mr. Dean sat beside Ran and cheerfully told him it was cool. He slowly approached Ran and decided to ask him an interesting question. Mr. Dean asked why Ran decided to leave the guys in this godforsaken place to die. The partners had been in the forest of the vanquished for quite some time. After 56 hours, they found a resting shelter in one of the caves. While here, Zan concluded that he had not felt hunger during all this time, only intense fatigue. The fatigue was eventually replaced by an overwhelming sleepiness that restored and healed them. The lad thought that this was one of the peculiarities of the defeated people. It's the best time for Zan and Kaylee to find clothes as long as they take shelter for rest. Zan turned around to the girl and realized he didn't want to wake her up since she was sleeping so sweetly. The guy realized that he might as well sleep longer too and recover. He stood looking at the sleeping Kaylee, remembering his recent dream. Zan had first dreamed of his partner sitting in the distance with long hair. The next morning, Kaylee noticed that Zan hadn't slept much and looked bad. The boy almost blabbed that he had seen her in a dream last night, but shut up just in time. Zan didn't know if he should tell Kaylee that he had dreamt about her because it would be awkward. They got into a small argument on attacking the defeated in case they were attacked. If they suddenly couldn't decide how to proceed, they would only hit one target. Zan finally realized that this was one of the conditions for successfully using the Force. Kaylee sat with her feet dipped in the water while Zan complained of fatigue. The boy had dozed off right after a bad dream because of the girl he had dreamt about. He asked the girl how she knew how long he had slept, and Kaylee explained that she had learned to time herself when she was alone. Zan thought back to his dreams and realized that they weren't really dreams, but her memories. Kaylee heard some mumbling and wanted to know what he was talking about, but he quickly changed the subject. The guy was glad they were finally finding out how long he could use his power. Zan wanted to know even more about controlling and manipulating the power. The lad realized that after they got into this forest, there wasn't much he didn't know about either of them. Escalibra also didn't understand much about her own abilities. The girl noticed the guy looked agitated and asked what was wrong with him. She also added that she thought Ran had sent them here to make Zan realize for himself who he really was. Either way, they were going to do their best and do their best. Zan climbed up a tree, saw some open space in the forest center, and thought that was where the clothes were hidden. The guy was excited and said it was easier than he had imagined. Kaylee cheerfully agreed with her partner, not noticing the giant monster behind her. A second later, the guy spotted the scarecrow with a yellow bandage on his arm. A startled Zan immediately realized that it was the very cloth they needed. He reacted quickly and warned his partner of the impending danger. The monster giggled loudly and had already approached Zan, taking him by surprise. Blocking Zan's view, he placed his claw hand on the guy, and it all began. After a while, someone's hands were firmly clutched into Mr. Rand's collar. Rand said he didn't expect the guy to stay down for so long. He asked the angry guy if they had met the right monster down there. Zan shouted in rage that tying the cloth to the monster itself wasn't fair. The guy started accusing him and yelling that he had no idea what happened to Kaylee. Mr. Rand didn't care about these words and simply asked if they would surrender. Zan didn't want to talk to Rand anymore and got ready to leave, calling his partner with him. Rand wasn't going to let the guy go that easily, so he grabbed him and asked him what he was going to do when he got there. The Lord asked if he would just run away from that guy again. Zan replied that he thought that was the best solution for everyone. He started to say that the monster was intense and moving too fast, and he had nothing else to do. Rand clarified with the guy if he didn't have any way to win. Kaylee stood up for her partner, yelling that they had studied their abilities in detail. The Lord asked the girl if they had learned everything they needed to. Escalibra didn't quite know what he was talking about, and clarified. Zan tried to lead his partner away from there, but she hadn't finished her sentence yet. Rand informed his partners that he would listen to them, and wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. Kaylee quickly noticed the guy walking away and asked him to wait for her. Zan wondered briefly if he was being too arrogant because he didn't have the same abilities as the others. He tried to push those thoughts away, but then he thought he just needed to be more confident. The test the Lord had prepared for them aimed to make them stronger. Zan remembered the monster and thought they wouldn't have gotten a trial they couldn't handle. Zan silently walked towards him when the monster crept up behind his partners. Kaylee was scared for her partner and started asking him what he was doing. The monster asked the guy if his head was okay or if he had already lost his mind. He decided to growl ominously and very loudly to make the picture clear. The guy just greeted the monster and said his name was Zanhev. He went on to say that it was a pleasure to meet him and bowed politely. The astonished man had never expected such a turn of events and laughed out loud. Pouring out a ringing laugh, he said that he never expected anyone to think of such a thing. The man asked if there was a reason he wanted to talk to him. Zan calmly replied that he had decided that he was exactly who they should talk to. He added that otherwise the Lord's cloth would not have been tied so neatly on him. The monster's appearance shattered a second later, and a completely different person stood before Zan. The boy was shocked, but the girl said that he turned out to be right. She looked at Zan cheerfully and was even glad he was so smart. The girl untied the yellow cloth from her hand and calmly handed it to the still surprised guy. She replied that she was just running an errand, and if the guy talked to her, she would just give him the cloth. Zan decided that he had passed the training, but he immediately wondered if it was too easy. An angry collie was already approaching Zan, asking what nonsense he had thought up without warning her. The guy cheerfully thought that he was one step closer to victory after all he had endured. Meanwhile, the girl was already pulling out her swords and said this cloth would be delivered to the Lord. She looked directly into Zan's eyes and said it was time to end this. Escalibra, as well as Zan himself, didn't expect this turn of events and called out loudly to the guy. The girl in that second started to turn back into a monster and attack the guy. The monster's eyes lit up red, and she asked Zan a sad question. She looked into the guy's eyes and asked how many of her children he had ruined before he showed up here. The monster girl menacingly told Zan that all the people here were her precious children. Scraps of his clothes reached Ransan, and he realized it had already begun. Immediately after, Mr. Din joined Ran and asked if he wanted to explain anything to him. Just then, he asked why Ran had sent his partners to this godforsaken place. Ran didn't doubt himself and calmly replied that it was all for training. Mr. Dean didn't quite understand the meaning of what he had heard about some kind of training. Ran explained that the partners had wanted to get stronger and he'd granted their request. Dean immediately asked if he had told them all about the forest and if that was true. He began to say that once upon a time, everyone in this forest was just regular people, and they ended up there for one reason. A long time ago, this place was sacred, and now it was just a place cursed by the tower. Dean wasn't sure if this was a good idea, but Rand didn't doubt it. Mr. Rand calmly said he believed in his partners and their abilities. He also added that if they failed, he would die with them. Dean realized it had been a long time since he'd had such an easy conversation or argument with Rand. He got ready to leave and said he wouldn't ask him anything else. Rand had nothing to do but simply thank Mr. Dean. Lastly, the master would say one more thing about Rand's statement. He specified that Rand should not say he would die with the guys anymore. Rand only silently thinking that it was for the complete trust of these two. Meanwhile, in the forest of the defeated, the monster girl was still pinning Zan to the ground. She still couldn't calm down and asked how many of her children he had already destroyed. The girl added angrily that it was unlikely he would know the exact number because killers don't count their victims. Zan couldn't stand it and shouted back that he hadn't intended to destroy anyone and they had attacked. The girl didn't want to believe it and was convinced that he had attacked first. At that moment, Kaylee intervened and said the girl was making a big mistake. On the other hand, the monster clarified to Kaylee that if she took one more step, her partner would get hurt. Escalibra was forced by those words to stop on the spot at that very second. The girl inquired if they were going to the tower by any chance. She also clarified that there were many like them, and they all ended up staying here. The girl convinced her partners to give up because she had caught them and would not let them climb the tower. Suddenly, she heard Zan calling for Escalibra in a hoarse voice. The boy could barely speak but hissed to his partner that she was their target. He quickly tried to put his arm out for Kaylee, but the monster immediately caught it. Suddenly, Zan yelled at the top of his voice like a rabid man into the forest of defeatists. The monster girl warned him not to move and took away his finger. She looked menacingly at Zan and told him his forearm was next in line. Zane was in unbearable pain and thought it was a trap from the start. He realized why she had destroyed him last time, so he wouldn't feel the pain and come back to her again. Zan also realized how well she had thought it out and wanted to escape immediately. The girl cheerfully said it was nice not to bleed to death over some tower. She looked at the guy's missing finger again and clarified something. The girl said that even though he wasn't bleeding, he felt the pain in full force. She was sure the boy was scared because he thought he would end up dead. Kaylee listened as she continued saying they would lose their memories forever. The girl ended her intimidation by saying they would eventually become monsters like them. That's why she asked Zane and his partner to give up and the deed was done. The girl asked them to return to Ran and tell him that they no longer wanted to go to the tower. She was about ready to hear Zane agree but saw something else in his eyes. The boy gripped the monster's hand tightly around his neck and began to speak. Zan menacingly told the girl that he wouldn't give up even if he had to die. Kaylee seemed to be not just surprised by such words, but shocked. Meanwhile, the Terrarium Heavenly Tower was home to the first guild of Avalon. At the very top of the tower was a hall where one of the members introduced himself as the guardian of the Avalon Guild to a confident man in a chair. He respectfully greeted the guild's vice-captain, Van Ziemend, who was of the 8th rank. Van started to tell the keeper that he was the guy who looked after the newcomers. The keeper paid his respects again and spoke of providing him comfort. Wang ordered to take care of the trial for the players, which would be held soon. He saw the smartphone at the keeper's side and asked if it was the same thing everyone was talking so much about. The custodian nodded approvingly and said that they had recovered it. He added that after doing some research, the item had no drop of energy left. At this time, someone entered the hall and said that it was just junk, and no one used it except him. Kim went inside with his phone and clarified that if they were interested, it was his ability. He went on to say that he can copy absolutely any ability. Kim also added that there was one condition for it to be used successfully. After a bit of silence, the guy cheerfully said he would keep it a secret. The guardian tried to stop the insolent guy by saying he wouldn't tolerate his antics. Kim Tae-wan thought he was too important and didn't notice the guardian's threats. At that moment, the vice-captain stood up and inquired if it was the same Kim Tae-wan. Van Ziemend informed him that he was looking forward to his performance. Kim smiled back but tried to get a good look at the vice-captain's face. He quickly realized that some special technique prevented him from being seen. The guy wasn't really interested in that. He was more interested in finding out where Dean was now. Kim quickly remembered how the master had put him in his place by humiliating him in front of everyone. He wanted to prove that Dean had made the wrong choice and that his humiliation had been for nothing. Kim promised to smear Zane against the wall at the test trial in 5 days. He truly believed that no one cared about his God-given power. In the forest of the defeated, the fight between the monster girl and her partners continued. Defeated was surprised and didn't understand why Zan resisted. She couldn't stop telling him to surrender, but the guy only calmly replied that he had heard that word many times before. Zan also added that many people hated him and still do. Initially, the girl was a little surprised but quickly gathered herself and started insulting Zan. While she was calling different but so familiar words to the guy, his finger was recovering. Keeping completely calm, Zan said he had heard it more than once and let her come up with something more interesting. Simultaneously, the guy took control of the situation and grabbed the monster. She clearly didn't expect this turn of events and screamed loudly. Zan sternly asked her if she really thought he would give up. He added that he would still show her what he could do even if he was in trouble. Monster Girl saw the change in the guy and couldn't believe it was super regeneration. She quickly remembered how dangerous it was and jumped backwards away from him with all her might. Kaylee was shocked that the vile creature itself jumped back from her partner. She was happy about this outcome, but noticed something was wrong with her partner. Kaylee noticed some incredible changes in Zane and realized she had never seen this before. There was no way she wanted to believe he had any abilities of his own. After a moment, the guy turned around and calmly beckoned her to move on. Zan held out his hand to Kaylee in a friendly manner, as if making an invitation. Kaylee seemed to hesitate momentarily and just stood there looking at him. A second later, she pushed all doubts away and accepted with genuine excitement. Her partner quickly transformed into Escalibra and was already in Zane's hands as a sword. The monster girl sat back and watched Zan's techniques. She continued her incomplete transformation into a giant monster and said she wouldn't sit idly by. Guy called his partner by name, and she interrupted him, saying she knew everything. Kaylee's eyes lit up with fire inside the legendary and influential sword. She looked forward with Zane and said their target was all these monsters. With each attack, the monsters seemed to get smaller for a moment, but after that, new ones came. Zan was tired and stopped to rest while Kaylee inquired about his condition. She shouted for him to let her out in her original form to support him. Surprisingly, the guy wasn't about to give up and refused her offer. He informed her that it wasn't over, and they weren't done with all the business. Zan was unhappy that even with all this effort, he lacked determination. The guy was too kind and just couldn't decide to eradicate them. He realized they were once just like him and imagined himself in their shoes. Zan informed Kaylee that he was genuinely sorry for all his failures. The boy rolled to the ground and thought he was lost, defeated, and broken. Just when Zan thought it was the end, this happened. Half dead and lying on the cold ground, Zan felt a light touch on his cheek.